Professor McGonagall took a long time to settle after her initial excitement. At first, she had been all praise for Scott's breakthrough in Transfiguration, insisting he must publish a paper that would bring honor to Hogwarts. Once she had calmed, though, she saw the other side of things. "I want to know how you got this lizard into the Ministry of Magic, Mr. Trollope," she said, "and into an office in the Department of Mysteries, which is a restricted location." Her expression was awkward, trying to stay stern, yet unable to stop herself from looking protective of her student. "I memorized the route," Scott said, "and then had a crow deliver the lizard." "A crow?" McGonagall frowned. "Those crows you summoned to fight for you? Are crows that intelligent?" Professor Flitwick asked, puzzled. "Not ordinary crows," Scott replied. "They're transfigured, like before." He glanced at Flitwick. "The method is the same as when we secretly filmed the Little Hangleton battle." He didn't mention Lambo, his closest companion, and he wasn't about to reveal its true nature. Flitwick and Dumbledore exchanged knowing looks. Only McGonagall appeared in the dark. She turned to Dumbledore and Flitwick, searching their faces. Flitwick stepped in to help Scott out. When McGonagall heard that students had done something like that without telling her, she was indignant. "2 Gryffindor students involved, and you didn't tell me?" she scolded. Flitwick and Dumbledore both averted their eyes toward the window. McGonagall snorted, but her stare at Scott grew serious. "You actually dared to do that? You were involved in a dangerous battle, and you intended to profit from it? Foolish. Fortunately, Phileas stopped you." Scott bowed his head. "But since you've spoken with Phileas and Albus about it afterwards, I won't pursue it." McGonagall's tone softened despite herself. "I must say, your talent in Transfiguration is rare. To implant a memory into a transfigured object at your age, that's extraordinary." "Thank you, Professor McGonagall," Scott said gratefully. "None of this would have been possible without your instruction and Professor Dumbledore's hint." McGonagall's features eased. Even the severe lines on her face softened. Dumbledore gave a small, innocent-looking smile. "Hints?" he said, feigning surprise. "You told me magic is the power of belief," Scott explained. "It was only a few words, but they broke something in my thinking and let me take a big step in Transfiguration." "Oh, that was nothing. I merely mentioned it," Dumbledore chuckled. Flitwick cleared his throat and steered the conversation back. "Let's turn to Mr. Bode." He looked to the other 2 professors. "What do you think his purpose is?" Dumbledore and McGonagall shook their heads. "I don't know what Mr. Bode wants me to do," Scott said. "I've mostly ignored him and Miss Grapeland." He hesitated, then added, "When the Caro siblings attacked me, I briefly sensed Mr. Bode's magic. I suspect he's behind several things, like that strange trial." "Magic sensing isn't evidence," Dumbledore said, shaking his head. Scott nodded. "On the surface, he's done nothing, just attempts to woo or threaten me as a senior in the Scholar Alliance. The only real consequence would be restricting some of my permissions within the Alliance, which isn't a big deal." Dumbledore considered for a moment. "I'll ask some acquaintances at the Ministry to keep an eye on him." "That's all we can do for now," McGonagall said. She fixed Scott with another look. "And you, Mr. Trollope, be careful. Don't cause more trouble, and tell your professor immediately if anything happens." "I understand, Professor," Scott said quickly and obediently. Dumbledore smiled. "Do you want help, Scott? I could speak to Bode and get your permissions in the Scholar Alliance restored." Flitwick added with a grin. "That would unsettle him. Wizards who know they're watched by Albus tend to get very nervous." "Wouldn't that just make him more cautious?" Scott asked. "Besides, I don't want any favors opened for me. As I told Miss Grapeland, I don't think any professors in the Scholar Alliance are better than those at Hogwarts." Even McGonagall smiled. "I won't undervalue other wizards," she said, "but of course Hogwarts is the best school of magic in the world." Flitwick nodded in agreement. "It may sound immodest, but I agree." "Then let someone keep an eye on Bode," Dumbledore said. "People only get away with doing strange things when no one is watching." The meeting ended. Scott bade farewell to the 3 professors and left McGonagall's office. Scott, at the other end of the corridor, his 3 roommates and Luna stood waiting. Scott strode over to them. "Are you all right?" Luna asked, concerned. "I'm fine," Scott said. "Did the professors dock points?" Milton asked anxiously. "The term's nearly over. Ravenclaw can't lose the House Cup because of us." Roger and Eddie tensed too. Scott understood. With Snape and Sirius constantly undermining each other this year, Gryffindor and Slytherin had lost so many points they were out of the running. Hufflepuff had rallied. Ravenclaw was currently in first place, but only by a slim margin. If the five of them lost enough points for Ravenclaw to lose the cup, they'd be resented. He didn't answer immediately, watching their faces. His roommates were nearly beside themselves. Luna had already drifted off into one of her daydreams. Unconcerned. Scott finally smiled. Don't worry, no points were deducted. That's great. We're still champions. Thank Merlin, thank the professors. For your noise in the corridor, Ravenclaw will lose 5 points. The sudden voice cut them off. Its tone left no doubt of the speaker's identity. Scott's roommates fell silent. Severus Snape emerged from around the corner, sneering, his black robes billowing as he stalked past. They didn't breathe again until he pushed open McGonagall's office door and went in. Eddie jabbed Scott with his elbow. Why didn't you warn us? Roger clamped a big arm around Scott's shoulders. You must have sensed Snape's magic. Why didn't you say anything? It's not my fault, Scott said. Who'd have thought points to be deducted for that? It's the weekend. Snape was in a mood and looking for something to punish. 5 points was hardly crippling, but it was a dig. Eddie muttered that Snape might have spoken up to let those 2 thugs escape on purpose. Roger shoved Scott free. Let the professors handle it. They made their way to the kitchens for lunch. On the way, Eddie sulked. Scott teased him, reminding him about the promotional videos other houses wanted and that Eddie had taken on editing work. Eddie brightened. He loved talking about his projects. By the time they reached the house elves' bustling kitchen, their moods had improved. Spotting Lulu, Scott remembered Tata, the house elf who had snuck in with the Caro siblings. Lulu, he called. Lulu came at once, skittering up to him. Esteemed young wizard, Lulu is here. Do you need anything? If you want something special, Lulu will make it at once. There's plenty of food, Scott said. I wanted to ask about Tata, the house elf the Caros brought that night. Tata, Lulu squealed, eyes widening. Tata, that bad elf! Then Lulu darted away and returned, dragging another house elf roughly by the arm. Here, Tata, Lulu announced. This bad elf attacked a Hogwarts student. Our esteemed headmistress told Lulu to watch her. Lulu and her friends have been watching. Tata can't escape. Tata looked miserable, an ugly scar on her forehead, bruises, and the tea towel she wore was filthy. It's you, she hissed at Scott, her eyes full of hatred. You let my little master be taken. How dare you? Lulu shrieked and shoved Tata, who fell and wailed. My poor little master, Tata failed. Tata banged her head against a table leg in despair, food clattering to the floor, adding a new wound. Lulu lunged and began beating Tata, shouting, Bad Tata! You attacked our little wizards. The other house elves dropped what they were doing and joined in, piling on, and the kitchen quickly became chaos. Tata's crying echoed everywhere. Harry, Ron, and Hermione pushed through the kitchen door, aghast at the scene. What on earth are you doing? Hermione cried, rushing forward. Stop! At her command, the house elves froze. Hermione covered her mouth at the sight of Tata. How could this happen? She murmured. What happened? Harry and Ron moved closer to Scott and his friends. Hermione spun on them, incredulous. You just watched this happen? Scott glanced up and continued eating calmly. Milton attempted an explanation, but Hermione cut him off. You were eating while a house elf was being beaten, Eddie shrugged. To be honest, she didn't look pitiful. Hermione's face flamed. Must she be beaten to death to look pitiful? Eddie smirked and kept eating, imitating Scott's calm. Harry pulled Hermione back. First, we need to find out exactly what happened. Hermione was shaking. It's obvious. These creatures do unpaid labor. No rest, no wages, not even proper clothes. She stared at Scott and his friends. And worse, they're being made to turn on each other because wizards treat them cruelly and with indifference. Her voice rose. The house elves began to scream in agreement, then burst into a chorus of angry complaints. Horrible. Too horrible. Rest. Wages. Clothes. They covered their ears and scattered, treating Tata, dragged along by Lulu, as something to avoid. Hermione looked startled and trembling with anger. I only wanted to help them. Scott raised a hand. Sit down first. We can talk after you calm down. Hermione sat, furious and disbelieving. I can't calm down. Scott turned to Harry with a smile. By the way, congratulations on the Quidditch Cup. Thanks, Harry said. Aren't you celebrating at the feast? Roger sniffed. Didn't you gorge yourself at the celebration? Ron, oblivious to Roger's tone, beamed. The celebrations are still going. Everyone's mad with joy. We were sent to fetch more food and drink from the house elves. Hermione was nearly breathless with anger. If I hadn't come in here, I'd never have known Hogwarts treats a race of beings like this. Everyone stared. Eddie blinked. You only just realized? Then who did you think carried your luggage, washed your clothes, cleaned your dormitory? Roger asked. Hermione looked embarrassed. I thought it was magic, Hogwarts doing it. Ron shrugged. House elves like to work. Serving wizards is their nature. Mum wanted one, but we couldn't afford it. That's wrong, Hermione said fiercely. Labor must be compensated. Ron pouted. You can't go against a creature's nature, even if it's odd. Hermione shook her head. This isn't nature. This is enslavement, a magical remnant of ancient cruelty. It's evil. Scott listened and then spoke calmly. Humans have always used animals, tamed them to serve. Muggles use cattle and horses to plow and carry, but nobody pays them wages. Hermione gaped at him. This is different. House elves have human-level intelligence. They deserve respect. Don't call them it. They are he or she. Scott shrugged. To me, they're not human. That's enough. That's arrogance. Utter arrogance. Hermione's face went bright red. I can't believe you would say that. Scott remained calm. Cattle and horses have intelligence too, and they're living beings, but their intelligence isn't equal to humans. If a being has intelligence equal to humans, treat them as equals. If not, they are like livestock. Isn't assuming equality where it doesn't exist itself arrogant? Hermione stammered. That's wrong. This is. She seemed trapped by his line of reasoning. Scott continued. Humanity has survived by fighting a cruel nature. Animals and magical creatures are part of that nature. Whether house elves' subservience is innate or imposed, it's a result of ancient wizards' struggles to survive. Survival is harsh. Humans sit at the top of the food chain because of millions of years of struggle. We should not waste the victories our ancestors won, nor betray the efforts they made for humanity. Hermione's eyes flickered. She was torn, but she persisted. That doesn't make it right. There's nothing wrong with enjoying the fruits of human victory, Scott said. I reserve my compassion for humans, wizard or muggle. Non-human races are not human. Why should they be treated as such? They don't want to be treated as humans, Ron muttered. The Ministry once asked centaurs if they wanted human status. They said no, they see themselves as animals. Hermione, recovering her composure, stood up suddenly, eyes burning red. That's not the point. I want to fight for basic rights for house elves. What's wrong with that? With that, she ran from the kitchen, tears in her eyes. 402. The last week before the exam, after Hermione ran off crying, the atmosphere in the kitchen turned awkward. Scott's 3 roommates and Luna all stopped eating and stared at him. Harry and Ron awkwardly rose from their seats as well. Oh, don't mind her, Ron said, too loudly. Hermione always has these strange ideas. Yes, she does, Harry echoed, uneasy. Scott remained calm and shook his head. Her ideas aren't strange at all. Kindness and compassion are good things. Ron and Harry shot him guarded looks. Scott smiled. We disagreed and discussed it. I don't accept all of her arguments, and I don't expect her to accept mine. That's good, Harry said, forcing a smile. I'll talk to Hermione. She's probably just upset for the moment. Ron muttered under his breath. She always tries to shove her opinions down everyone's throats. His voice was low, but everyone heard it. Harry gave Ron an elbow nudge. Let's get back and keep celebrating. Everyone's waiting, and there's food. He hurried to the stove, spoke to the house elves working there, then came back to say goodbye, pulling Ron with him. Congratulations again on your victory. Scott paused mid-wave. Oh, right. Harry and Ron stopped. Scott looked Harry in the eyes. Harry, have you learned it? The magic Sirius was teaching you? Judging by how he looked, Harry probably wasn't being haunted by Voldemort's nightmares as often anymore. It's hard, Harry admitted, actually smiling, but I've made progress. Congratulations. You'll be better off once you master it. Thanks. After they left, Scott returned to his meal. Scott, were the things you said in that debate with little McGonagall true? Eddie asked. What do you think? I don't know. Maybe I was just trying to throw her off, Scott said with a shrug. He hadn't planned to be philosophical. His remarks had mostly been a response to Hermione's accusations. Whether they made perfect sense, he hadn't given much thought to. Milton leaned in. House elves are a bit pitiable, but I never felt there was anything wrong with how things are. Roger disagreed gently. As long as we don't abuse them, they should be allowed to choose what they want. Milton nodded. Luna, sitting beside Scott, set down her knife and fork. Full? Scott asked. Luna nodded. I'm full. Her gaze drifted, as if lost in thought. After a moment, she spoke again. I don't have house elves at home, Scott hummed. They're very happy at Hogwarts, Luna added, watching the elves bustle. It would be hard to change their minds. What if their minds do change? Luna turned to Scott suddenly. What if they demand wages and holidays? Then give it to them, Scott said easily. The goblins run Gringotts and do all right. Oh, Luna nodded. Scott, curious, asked, if Hermione asked you to help improve house elves' rights, would you agree? Luna tilted her head, thought for a moment, then nodded and shook her head, one after the other. Eddie, listening, asked, which is it? Nodding then shaking means what? Luna didn't answer at first, her eyes unfocused again. Scott guessed and said, nodding means you'd help. Shaking means you don't think you can do much about it. Her eyes refocused, and she nodded. The hardest part is not fighting for their rights, Scott added. It's awakening their own consciousness. If their deeply rooted beliefs can't be changed, no amount of outside help will do much. Luna nodded again. It can be done, Scott continued. It might make the wizarding world better, or it could make things worse. If they awaken and resent wizards, they could become enemies. Milton chimed in. Goblins generally don't like wizards anyway. Everyone needs something they find meaningful, Luna said. If this is what Hermione wants, I'll help when she needs me. Is she your friend? Eddie asked. Not yet, Luna said, but maybe she will be. I hope you make more friends, Scott said. I will, Luna promised earnestly. After the late lunch, Scott said goodbye and went alone to the room of requirement for practice. Lately, he'd been improving his combat abilities and the use of Transfiguration in battle under the Ravenclaw mentor's guidance. This weekend, he'd achieved new results. In the empty room where the Ravenclaw portrait watched, Scott stood by a lone desk. An iron block sat on the desk. He spoke the Transfiguration charms, then waved his wand. The black iron softened into a liquid, flowed, and began to take the rough shape of a raven. With careful transfigurations, the bird's form grew more detailed. As the work progressed, a complex runic circuit formed across its surface, fiery red runes flowing along the raven's body. Flames kindled over the bird until it was enveloped in crimson fire. Caw! The raven's beak opened and cawed, black feathers trembling in the flames but remaining unharmed. It spread its wings and took off, a flaming black ball in the air. Even from a short distance, Scott felt the heat. It worked, he said, smiling. He produced a block of wood from his pocket and tossed it into the room. Attack it. At his command, the flames around the raven dimmed. The raven opened its mouth and spat a scorching line of fire that struck the wood, turning it to ash almost instantly. The bird circled happily, then landed on the desk, leaving a few charred footprints. After about a minute, the raven's runes flared, and it ignited again. No mistakes, Scott cheered. He waved his wand and reverted the raven to a bare iron block. The block glowed red-hot. The desk sizzled. Scott moved the iron to a stone slab in the corner with another flick. Seems you really succeeded. In the portrait, Ravenclaw watched with a faint smile. I must thank you for your help, Mentor, Scott said, bowing to the portrait. You helped me analyze the runic circuit of the Ring of Arson and guided the modifications. The Ring of Arson had been decoded from a gift Michael gave him at Christmas in 1994, a worn parchment that looked like a clumsy cooking menu but was actually an alchemist's encrypted notes. Scott had wanted to integrate that runic circuit into his transfiguration for a long time. With the mentor's advice, he had finally done it. From now on, his transfigured creations would not only have defensive or auxiliary functions, but could also produce attack effects similar to charms. The Arson Raven, with its high-temperature flames and ranged fire breath, expanded his combat options and tactics. This is also your accomplishment, Ravenclaw said calmly. Continue to work hard, my apprentice. Scott straightened and smiled. I will follow your teachings, Mentor. The new week began. The excitement of the Quidditch finals faded, and the students returned to studying. But this week was different. It was the last week before the end-of-year exams. Many students, anxious or uncertain, devoted themselves to frantic revision or searched for illicit potions and shortcuts. Eddie had given up selling fake potions for a while, but people still asked him for Baruffio's brain elixir. His old supply of brain elixir had really been doxy droppings. "It's like this every year," Eddie complained in the dormitory. "There are always fools trying to cheat. They don't even understand that real Baruffio's brain elixir wouldn't save them." Roger laughed. "Professors can tell when someone's cheated. It's too easy to spot. Cheating at Hogwarts is practically impossible. Except they catch a few cheaters every year," Eddie grinned. "How's revision going?" Milton asked. He was the only one of the 3 fifth years who seemed truly worried about his OWLs. "About as good as it gets," Roger said. "I don't expect great results. I'll be happy with 5 or 6 passes." Scott was frank. "I'm not worried. I won't get top marks in everything, but I should get an OWL in every subject I'm taking." Milton hugged his stack of books. "I need to study harder." Scott and Roger exchanged a look and shook their heads. Milton wasn't a poor student. His anxiety and lack of confidence were the problem. Experience had taught them that trying to comfort him then would only make him overthink. Leaving him alone to study was the best course. There was one more oddity that week. The care of magical creatures assistant, the popular Miss Grapeland, had suddenly left. Scott only heard it from other students and didn't have the energy to investigate. Rumor said Dumbledore was looking into the earlier attack in the Forbidden Forest, but Scott pushed the matter aside. Exams came first. Hermione, however, remained a problem. She'd run away crying and returned having lost their debate, but she clearly wasn't convinced and kept trying to get even. Scott refused another debate, citing exam preparation, but Hermione took exams seriously and pressed no further. Still, whenever she saw Scott, her expression was eager, as if she wanted to rush him with freshly prepared arguments. Harry and Ron looked at him with sympathetic expressions. Roger and the others, who knew the background, watched with amusement. "Her desire to win is too strong," they said. Luna found it entertaining. "She won't give up until she wins the debate," she chuckled. Scott nodded. He muttered, half to himself, "We already exchanged views and agreed we won't reach a consensus. It would be better to respect each other's opinions and move on." Time passed, and Scott's 5th year was drawing to a close. He was about to sit the most important exams since he'd first come to Hogwarts, the ordinary wizarding level examinations. For Hogwarts students, the first week of June was always exam week. But for 5th years taking OWLs and 7th years taking NNUTs, those weeks were tougher. Both sets of level exams lasted 2 weeks and were tightly supervised by the ministry. As June began, officials from the Wizarding Examinations Authority of the Department of Magical Education arrived at Hogwarts to act as chief examiners. Before the exams started, Professor Flitwick gathered Scott and the other Ravenclaw 5th years to go over a few important points. "I don't need to tell you," he said, "but you should understand that your ordinary wizarding level results will have a significant impact on your futures." He paused, then continued with the practical details. "Your exams will last 2 weeks. Morning sessions will be written papers, afternoons practicals, except for practical astronomy, which will be held late at night. Unless there are unforeseen circumstances, the written papers will be sat in the Great Hall. You will be staggered with the 7th years. Practical exam locations will be posted on the notice board at the Great Hall entrance. Please check them yourselves. The examiners are appointed by the Wizarding Examinations Authority," he added, "and they're all very experienced wizards." He named one of them with particular emphasis. Madame Griselda Marchbanks will be among them. Madame Marchbanks is perhaps the most long-serving employee at the ministry. She examined Albus Dumbledore in the 1899 NEWT exams and has continued to serve on the authority ever since. In other words, she has been examining for well over 100 years. No matter what little tricks a student tries, they will not escape her notice. The students buzzed at the idea. "That's incredible. Dumbledore's examiner is still active?" Roger whispered to Scott. "She must be older than Dumbledore and still working." Professor Flitwick said no trick can escape her. She must have unusually sharp eyes, Roger added. Flitwick let them discuss for a moment before continuing. The written papers have been charmed with the strictest anti-cheating enchantments. Self-writing quills are strictly forbidden in the exam hall, and memory balls, detachable cuff notes, and auto-correcting inks are banned as well. Of course, I don't doubt that the children of Ravenclaw will behave. I only remind you so you're not penalized by unclear rules. He clapped once. The results will be published in mid-July and delivered by Owl. I hope you all do well. The students applauded and exchanged quiet words of encouragement. Monday, June 4th, morning. After breakfast, the Great Hall was cleared and several officials from the Wizarding Examinations Authority, accompanied by Deputy Headmistress McGonagall, entered. Waiting outside the doors, Scott and the others finally saw the legendary centenarian examiner, Griselda Marchbanks. She was indeed very old, white-haired with a wobbly step, but lively and respected by everyone, including McGonagall. Professor McGonagall reappeared at the Great Hall doors. The charms written paper is about to begin, she announced to the fifth years waiting outside. Line up for inspection and enter in an orderly fashion. Scott and his classmates fell into line. Inside the doorway, an official from the Wizarding Examinations Authority waved his wand toward them and said, "Enter." The Great Hall had been transformed. Decorations were cleared away, the 4 house tables removed, and rows of single desks set up, all facing the staff table at the far end. On the examiner's table, besides spare quills, ink, and parchment, sat a huge hourglass to time the paper. Madame Marchbanks, white-haired and composed, took her place in the center of the staff table. A young invigilator called loudly, "All students, please find your seats. Names have been pasted on the desks." Scott found the desk with his name, sat down, and set out the quill and ink he'd brought. The seating was mixed. Students from different houses were scattered among the desks. Cedric was sitting in front of him. "This is different from what my dad told me," Cedric murmured, turning his head. When he took his exams, they didn't have fixed seats, and there weren't so many invigilators. "Perhaps the authority has reformed the exams," Scott suggested. "Last year they added a dueling component to the end-of-year tests." Cedric was about to say more, but straightened when the invigilator's gaze fell on him. Scott sat up too, smiling faintly at the invigilator, who returned the smile and moved on. Soon every 5th year in the Great Hall was seated. "I hope you obey the rules and do well," Professor McGonagall said from the door, then left. "Is everyone here?" Madame Marchbanks asked. "Yes, madam," the young invigilator replied. "We may begin." Madame Marchbanks waved her wand. A tall stack of parchment levitated from the staff table, and with almost mechanical precision, each paper floated to its assigned desk. She tapped the hourglass with her wand. "The exam officially begins." The hourglass flipped, sand falling to mark the time. Scott did not rush to write. He read through the paper first. The written charms paper covered 5 years of material, but the questions were straightforward, without deep expansion. He dipped his quill and answered steadily. When he finished, he glanced up at the hourglass and saw there was still a little sand in the top half. He checked his answers and then let his mind wander. His daydreaming felt long, but eventually Madame Marchbanks announced the end of the paper. A chorus of groans rose from the hall. "Papers, please," she said, and with a flick of her wand, all the papers on the desks flew back to the staff table and reassembled into a neat stack. "The charms written paper is over." The room filled with conversation. Cedric turned to Scott. "How do you think you did?" he asked. "Should be fine," Scott replied with a smile. Cedric wanted to discuss answers, but invigilators were already shepherding the 5th years out to make way for the 7th years. Scott and Roger left together, talking not about the paper but about lunch, until Milton approached, looking worried. "How did you two do?" Milton asked anxiously. Scott and Roger didn't answer directly. "Don't fret about a paper that's done," Scott said, patting Milton on the shoulder. "Come and guess what's for lunch." Milton, prone to overthinking, took the hint. They declined his suggestion to study more and instead went for a walk by the Black Lake. "The most important thing now is to relax," Roger advised, and Milton reluctantly agreed. As they left the castle, Fred and George Weasley caught up with them. Fred wore a smug, schadenfreude-filled smile. "Oh, Scott, Heard you annoyed our little McGonagall, he teased. You should count yourself lucky, said George with a wink. Thankfully, it's exam time. Otherwise, you'd have seen how terrifying she can be. Fred added, You can tell by our little brother Ron, his face has gotten worse and worse lately. Your news is a bit behind, Scott said, steering the conversation. Is your promotional video finished? He'd helped the twins with editing and post-production, leaving them to handle the simplest tasks. It's finished, they boasted. Just wait, we'll amaze the whole school. Scott grinned. He was looking forward to the inevitable blushes and indignation from Gryffindor when the video appeared. The group chatted and laughed, strolling along the lake while Fred and George's clownish banter gradually loosened Milton up. After a relaxed lunch, they returned to the examination hall for the afternoon's charms practical. The practical had been set up in the Great Hall in a level-based format. Students had to clear a series of stages using specific charms. Each level had an invigilator to score it. The first level was a locked door, which Scott opened easily with Alohomora. The second level was a tall wooden fence. He used a cutting charm to remove several planks and slipped through. In the third, several golden snitches flew wildly in a confined space. Scott cast a freezing charm to stop them from darting. For the fourth level, he repaired a dilapidated small boat with Reparo and rowed through a narrow waterway. At the fifth level, a cluster of bludgers attacked. Scott raised a shield charm to block them and then used a blasting spell to destroy them all at once. The invigilator watched, astonished, and Scott's practical exam was complete. As he stepped out of the hall, the twins, who'd taken their practicals earlier, rushed over. How did you handle those bludgers? Fred asked. George nearly had his head knocked off. He used a shattering charm to break them. You almost had your nose crooked, George shot back indignantly, and the two of them launched into bickering, tearing into each other until Scott drifted to the edge of their argument and watched with the usual calm. Cedric joined them. You were right, he told Scott. They really have reformed the exams. Was the practical not like this before? Scott asked. My dad said the charms practicals he took were boring, just casting specified spells at fixed targets. That does sound dull, Cedric agreed, completely uncreative. Fred and George stopped their squabble and echoed Cedric before launching into complaints about how much more exciting the exams could be. If it were up to us, we'd make it far more interesting, George said, already babbling ideas for levels and traps. Students nearby edged away at the thought. If the twins had their way, many people would be in trouble. Fred, George, it's not a game, Cedric said kindly, bringing them up short. 404. Ravenclaw's celebration dinner, Scott's second-day exam, was Transfiguration, with Madame Marchbanks again serving as chief examiner. After the written paper finished that morning, Scott found himself surrounded by a crowd. As Hogwarts' acknowledged Transfiguration prodigy, many students wanted to compare answers and pick his brain for the afternoon practical. Too many people were talking at once. Scott couldn't answer everyone, even if he had several mouths. Sorry, there are too many of you. I'll do my best, but I can't answer everyone, he said, a little louder than usual. How about this? I'll put my answers down on a parchment so everyone can look. The students blinked in surprise. Isn't that a bit much trouble? Someone murmured. Scott, I didn't expect you to be so generous. Thank you, another said, smiling as if discovering a new side to him. Scott inwardly bristled. How unapproachable must I look? He thought. I am sorry my kindness wasn't obvious at first. Still, he produced a sheet of parchment and, from memory, magically impressed his completed paper onto it. Instead of gratitude, the student's immediate response was practical skepticism. So you weren't going to write them out by hand, one blurted, echoing everyone's thought. Scott frowned. Does it matter? He asked helplessly. No, thank you, the student said brightly and snatched the parchment. Others immediately used duplication charms on it, and copies began circulating. Finally, Scott slipped free of the crowd and walked away with Roger and Milton. Milton still looked uneasy and even avoided glancing at Scott's answers. Transfiguration's my weakest subject, he said, worried. I'd rather not see them. It might affect how I do this afternoon. Both Scott and Roger had grown used to Milton's pre-exam nerves, so they didn't prod him. Instead, they brought up the summer holiday. Are you going abroad for the break? Roger asked. The Quidditch World Cup is in Britain this year. It's a shame to miss it. I'll visit my parents first and then come back for the World Cup final, Scott said. I'll at least see the decisive match. Not bad, Roger smiled. I'm planning to watch the whole thing. He then launched into a connoisseur's breakdown of national Quidditch teams and their chances. Scott and Milton listened with interest despite being less knowledgeable. You think the British team has a shot since they're hosts? Scott asked. Only a chance, Roger shrugged, not overly optimistic. Pay attention to your safety, though. Scott hesitated, then offered the reminder. Don't forget the attack in the Forbidden Forest. The Caro siblings' behavior shows the Death Eaters might be active again. Roger's face darkened. You think they'll cause trouble at the World Cup? It's possible, Scott said. The Ministry is a chaotic mix right now. Roger looked grimmer. If something happens with so many wizards from around the world here, the British Ministry would be in a lot of trouble. It's already embarrassing enough, Milton muttered. There have been so many incidents, and the Ministry hasn't handled them well. They can't hide it. Roger nodded and asked, Were the Caro siblings caught? Scott shook his head. Their attack on underage students at Hogwarts was a serious crime. The whole Wizarding Council and the Legal Enforcement Squad had declared them wanted, but after apparating out of the Forbidden Forest, they vanished. No one knew where they were hiding. Scott suspected Dumbledore had information, possibly even about Voldemort, supplied by Snape, who was still operating as a double agent. In the original timeline, Voldemort's resurrection had surprised Dumbledore. This time, the outcome was less certain. Scott didn't dwell on it. He wasn't Harry. He had no direct link to Voldemort, and many of those greater conflicts didn't involve him. The enemy he expected to face was likely far worse than Lord Voldemort. He had no idea how it would play out, but he felt he had to be ready. After lunch, the Transfiguration practical began. For Scott, it was unusually simple. Students had to retrieve a golden key hidden inside a set of curved pipes using Transfiguration without damaging or altering the pipes. Scott transformed into a mouse and retrieved the key in under 3 minutes. Many other students weren't so smooth. They conjured small creatures that could enter the pipes, but those creatures couldn't move independently and had to be controlled by wandwork, which many students, still only at the early stages of their transfiguration, struggled to manage. The conjured animals often just scurried aimlessly and failed to find the key. Scott's rapid, decisive performance caught Madame Marchbank's attention. The old witch, well over 130 years, stumbled over to him, and he stood to meet her. "Good afternoon, Madame Marchbanks," he greeted politely. She peered at him with cloudy old eyes, then smiled, the wrinkles in her face smoothing in layers. "What a handsome boy. What's your name?" "Scott Trollop, madam." "That surname, Muggle family?" she asked after a moment. Scott nodded. "Remarkable," she said slowly. "You remind me of Albus in his younger days, but you're from a Muggle family, and at your age you're already more accomplished than he was." "Thank you for that," Scott said, genuinely touched. Madame Marchbanks's smile broadened. "You are not being modest, and that's good." She spoke on, slowly. "For years people treat Albus like a legend. Students don't even try to surpass him, and that's not healthy." She reached out like a withered branch and patted Scott's arm gently. "Albus is powerful, but in the end, he's only one person. From an old woman's point of view, he's had too much to carry. I don't want everyone to rely on him. I hope a child will one day surpass him." She withdrew her hand and unsteadily turned away. Scott watched her bent back, smiled, and left the examination room. Whether he could surpass Dumbledore, he didn't know, but he would try. He had no choice. If his future opponent came from Slytherin and he couldn't match Dumbledore, he knew the consequences could be fatal. Over the next days, Scott and his classmates took exams in turn: defense against the dark arts, potions, history of magic, astronomy, herbology, ancient runes, divination, care of magical creatures, arithmancy, and Muggle studies. He hadn't chosen divination or Muggle studies as electives, so he didn't sit those practicals. 12 days later, the exams finished. On the morning of the final day's written exam for Muggle studies, cheers erupted across the Great Hall. Those who hadn't even taken the elective joined in, and the sound spread like wildfire through Hogwarts. The staff of the Wizarding Examinations Authority quietly withdrew as the students celebrated. The professors didn't stop it. Even Professor McGonagall, usually stern, watched with a faint smile. Professor Flitwick announced a celebratory feast for Ravenclaw that evening. Everyone got busy. Scott and Flitwick helped redecorate the common room. Flitwick waved his wand and temporarily expanded the space several times over. Scott pushed the sofas to the edges and gathered wooden tables and chairs into a long banquet table. Flitwick conjured a blue tablecloth with a large house crest. The girls brought elegant candelabra and lit white-scented candles. Milton, members of the Classical Music Club, and the Toad Choir set up instruments and arranged a small stage. The house elves enthusiastically delivered platters of food. Eddie slipped into Hogsmeade by a secret passage and returned with several crates of butterbeer. As night fell, Ravenclaws filled the common room, joined by Professor Flitwick and Helena, and the feast began. Music, singing, laughter, delicious food, and butterbeer. The seventh years, about to leave Hogwarts, toasted Professor Flitwick one by one, expressing gratitude and solemn goodbyes. The soft-hearted professor wiped away tears between embraces, offering each graduate his best wishes. Scott and Luna sat together on a sofa, sipping smooth butterbeer and watching the scene. "This is beautiful, isn't it?" Luna said in her usual airy voice. "Tonight, this place is free from Sorrow Meng." "You're right," Scott agreed. Luna turned to him. "You'll graduate in 2 years." 2 years, Scott echoed. He was about to begin his 6th year. The final 2 years at Hogwarts felt like a new stage. 2 years is short, Luna said softly. "I've already been enrolled for 2 years. Scott looked at her. "Even though we both have premonitions," he said quietly, "I hope we can all spend our school days in peace." Luna's gaze drifted to the moonlit window. "The prophecy is about to come true," she said with certainty. Professor Trelawney's prophecy about the Thestrals. Scott's expression shifted as the memory returned, the prophecy he'd almost forgotten. Luna recited it. "Those dark stars will eventually return, at the juncture of old and new, and the revived witch will face crisis." "The juncture of old and new," Scott murmured. "The Ministry hasn't announced a change in leadership. Could it mean the old and new at Hogwarts?" Luna shook her head. "No, I believe the Ministry will get a new Minister of Magic this summer," she said confidently. Scott wondered silently whether Fudge might be replaced. "You're becoming more and more like someone gifted in divination," he said. "When Professor Trelawney prophesied about the Thestrals, I watched her open her inner eye," Luna replied. "So I learned it." "You opened your inner eye?" Scott asked, surprised. "I think so," Luna nodded. Scott thought it sounded casual, too easy, but he didn't doubt her. Talent was an unreasonable thing. He knew that from his own strange path in Transfiguration and instant alchemy. "I can't prophesy like Trelawney yet," Luna added, "but I can tell when a prophecy is about to happen." "Is it a vague feeling or a precise time?" Scott asked eagerly. "A vague feeling," she said. "I can sense that things from the prophecy are drawing near, but I can't say the exact day." She set down her empty bottle and looked up at Scott. "Sorry, my premonition about your prophecy is still vague, but if I have more, I'll tell you right away." Slightly disappointed but grateful, Scott smiled. "That's already very helpful. Thank you, Luna." "You're welcome. I hope you'll be all right," she said, smiling back. 4 of 5. The day before leaving Hogwarts, Scott and Luna were chatting when Penelope, her eyes still rimmed red, walked over. She sat down casually beside them, picked up a bottle of butterbeer from the table, popped the top, and took several large, unguarded gulps. Scott looked at her, a little surprised. He hadn't expected the usually quiet, elegant prefect to show such a side. "What are you staring at?" Penelope shot him a sidelong glance. Scott smiled. "Butterbeer hasn't got much alcohol in it. How could you be drunk?" Penelope laughed softly. "I'm not drunk. I'm just a little sad." Her voice was quiet. "I didn't realize how sad I'd feel about leaving Hogwarts until now." She tipped the bottle up again, drank some more, and then craned her head back to stare at the common room ceiling, its deep blue dotted with stars. "Just thinking that I'll never walk into this room again after we leave. It makes me very sad." "Not just the common room," Luna said unexpectedly. "You won't have many chances to walk into the castle again." Penelope turned and looked at Luna with an expression that was hard to read. Scott quickly tried to cheer her. "You could apply to teach here," he offered. You might come back. Penelope snorted and then laughed. I'm not angry. She winked at Luna. Luna's right, though. Unless Hogwarts needs a new teaching assistant, I can't come back. I'm not nearly qualified to be a professor. Coincidentally, Miss Grapeland resigned, Scott said. Penelope rolled her eyes. I didn't mean care of magical creatures, she said. Besides, if I weren't afraid of dying, maybe Dumbledore would hire a less skilled defense against the dark arts professor. Let's not, Scott said, shaking his head. This year's defense position had been odd. Sirius and Lupin had each taken a semester, and the year had passed uneventfully. Penelope, where will you work after graduation? Luna asked. Penelope ruffled her hair, annoyed. I don't know. There aren't many jobs in the British magical world for us graduates. She stood up, smiling as if to change the subject. All right, let's not talk about unpleasant things. With the half-empty butterbeer in hand, she walked over to the small stage where the choir practiced. No one was singing. Milton and a few others were playing instruments. Penelope climbed up, handed the bottle to the violinist, and the music stopped. Every head in the common room turned to look at her. She let her gaze sweep the room, and after a pause said gently, Sorry, I thought I had a lot to say a moment ago, but now I don't know where to start. She sounded genuinely a little drunk as she rambled, and began to tell stories from her 7 years at Hogwarts and recall the friends she'd made. Her words were scattered, unlike the sharp, capable prefect everyone knew, but no one interrupted. They listened closely. She talked for a long time, and finally, as if sobering up, she stopped. I don't know why, but I feel like crying. She wiped her eyes. Several girls in the room began to cry, especially the 7th-year girls, and the 7th-year boys had red eyes too. I am so grateful for this experience. I will never forget these memories. She raised her voice. Finally, I want to say, long live Hogwarts. Long live Ravenclaw. Long live Hogwarts. Long live Ravenclaw, echoed through the room. Milton and the other musicians started to play his composition, Impressions of Ravenclaw. The celebration lasted late into the night. One by one, the graduating 7th years went up to speak, some bawling, some laughing. It was a night of farewells. Time moved quickly toward the day before leaving. That evening, Hogwarts held its customary lively end-of-year feast. Scott had just woken the next morning when the impatient Weasley twins burst into the Ravenclaw common room. Fred grinned at him. Morning, Scott. We've come to borrow your large mirror. No problem, Scott said readily. He hesitated, then asked, Are you sure you want to use it at the feast? In front of the whole school? Of course, Fred said. It's our work. George tried to drag Scott into agreeing it was theirs. Scott warned them, You do know what the consequences might be, right? A lot of people won't be pleased, Professor McGonagall included. For a moment their faces flickered, but they hardened quickly. Holidays start tomorrow, George said. No points, no detentions, maybe just some reproach. We won't change our minds. We're going to astonish everyone. Scott wanted to remind them they weren't graduating, but he had to admit he was curious to see the result, so he lent them the modified mirror. The twins thanked him and carried it off, beaming. Scott stretched and walked down the tower toward the Great Hall. In the corridor he saw Harry and then Ron and Hermione appear behind him. Hermione's eyes widened when she saw Scott, and she came over briskly. Good morning, Scott, she said, voice a little stiff. How did you do on your exams? I think I did fine. Thanks. Scott replied with a smile. His friendly smile softened Hermione's expression briefly, but her serious look returned, almost like McGonagall's. I wanted to talk about what we discussed earlier, about house elves. Let's have breakfast first, Scott said, rubbing his stomach. I'm starving. Yeah, Hermione, we're hungry too, Harry chimed and winked at Scott. Ron added, Scott and Harry are right. I don't see what there is to discuss about house elves right now. Let's eat. Scott and Harry looked at Ron. They all had spoken the same, but it was obvious Ron genuinely wanted to eat. The three began to pull them toward the Great Hall. Hermione turned on Ron sharply. Don't forget, your breakfast was made by those poor house elves. You ate it too, Ron retorted. You've eaten it for 3 years. That's because I didn't know, Hermione snapped. I tried to give them money and they wouldn't take it. I told you not to go against their nature. Ron shouted. They began to argue back and forth, cheeks flushed. Scott watched Ron turn red in the face and thought, a little helplessly, that Ron was hopelessly simple. It took Scott and Harry a gentle bit of persuasion to get them to stop. Hermione gave Ron a cold sniff and turned back to Scott. He felt a momentary dread. "Are you calm now, Hermione?" he asked quickly. "Yes, I'm calm," she said stiffly. "That's good." Scott smiled. "I know where we both stand. I don't think either of us will convince the other. How about we just respect each other?" "Humph." Hermione was unimpressed, but Harry backed Scott up. "I think that's a good idea. Hermione can prove her point with action, and Ron and I will help." He tugged at Ron, who didn't protest. Scott remembered Hermione's SPW campaign from the original, her fierce, tireless devotion, and felt a flash of pity for Harry. He had no idea what he'd just agreed to, and he'd even roped Ron in. "Of course," Hermione said, a small, determined smile forming with Harry's support. "I'll prove it with action." She looked at Scott with a provocative glint. "I'm looking forward to it," Scott said, though he no longer dared to provoke Hermione. Let the house elf matter be, he thought, and finished his breakfast briskly. He left the great hall alone, made his way up to the 8th floor, and slipped into Helena's portrait room, using his magic senses to avoid other students. "Good morning, Scott," the girl in the painting greeted him unusually warmly. "Summer vacation is almost here. Where will you go for the holidays?" "Sorry, today's update didn't reach 4,000 words. I'll try to update more tomorrow." 406. Scott's 5th year ends Mas. In Helena's study, Scott and the girl in the painting chatted about the Quidditch World Cup while summer holiday plans were discussed. The girl wasn't very interested, so she let him go shortly after. "I thought you had some good plans," she said. "Why does everyone like Quidditch so much?" Scott smiled. "Because apart from Quidditch, there aren't many lively, interesting things in the wizarding world." The girl pouted. "Fine. Go see Mother." The huge landscape painting slid aside, revealing the door to an inner room. Scott pushed it open and stepped through. "Mentor, you're here." He didn't linger in Helena's study. After going over his summer study plans with the Ravenclaw mentor, he bade farewell and left. He went back to the dormitory to pack, chatted with his classmates in the common room until dinner began, and then left the tower. Dusk had fallen by the time he reached the Great Hall. Candlelight and torchlight braided together, making the vast chamber as bright as day. All 4 house tables were already full. Everyone wore formal wizarding robes and pointed hats. At the Gryffindor table, Fred and George had placed a large rectangular mirror on a wooden stand. The twins were grinning broadly, taking obvious pleasure in the attention. Eddie on the Ravenclaw table made a sour face. "You know, today Ravenclaw is going to win the House Cup." He turned to Scott. "Hey, Scott, how are their results? They won't beat us, will they?" Scott's expression must have read oddly. He shrugged. "Don't worry. Like I said, their promotional video and ours aren't the same style." "Good. I'm really looking forward to Gryffindor's video," Milton added. He and most of the Ravenclaws watched the twins with curiosity. Across the hall, the other students kept glancing at Fred and George, eager to see what they'd done. Even Percy, which was a rare concession, praised his mischievous brothers. When Dumbledore led the faculty into the hall, the twins started the promotional video. Music swelled, and the surface of the mirror filled with images. A golden-red banner unfurled, and the word Gryffindor appeared in large letters. Professor McGonagall's face softened with a relieved smile. Dumbledore gave a gentle nod, and Sirius and Lupin both looked pleased. The video began formally, detailing the house's history, its head, famous alumni, and the common room, with clear visuals and helpful subtitles. Most Gryffindors sat up a little prouder. Harry, however, seemed embarrassed at being celebrated. He hunched on his stool, his face flushed as Ron patted him with proud solidarity. Then the screen shifted, and Fred and George popped up, waving at the camera. A subtitle read, "Gryffindor, the happiest house at Hogwarts." From that point, the tone changed. The twins' film became a fast-moving montage of their pranks, reactions of classmates caught unaware, the glee of friends rolling with the joke, and the humiliation of those who couldn't laugh. Many Gryffindors laughed along on screen, but others, like Percy and Ron, were shown at their most furious. In the hall, the house split. Plenty of Gryffindors chuckled and joined in, but a number who cared about appearances began to glare. Percy, red-faced, shouted, "Turn it off!" His brothers were gripped by the crowd and dragged backward by classmates who were enjoying the show. Students from the other houses laughed outright, Slytherins the loudest, delighting in Gryffindor discomfort. Professor Snape said something acid enough that McGonagall shot a severe look toward the twins, who were still being jostled by their peers. "Scott, you were right," Eddie said with relish. "Their style is totally different from ours, completely offbeat." "Do you think they'll get away with it?" Milton asked. Scott glanced back at Gryffindor. "Most of them are enjoying it. Only a few people care enough to cause trouble." The music swelled again, and another subtitle flashed. Gryffindor, the house that plays Quidditch best at Hogwarts. Boos erupted from the other tables. Slytherin and Ravenclaw, even Hufflepuff joined in. Scott couldn't help laughing. Roger leaned over. "Did you help with the post-production?" Scott shook his head. "I did most of the post, but I didn't add that line. They probably put that one in themselves." "Humph," Roger muttered, annoyed, and switched his attention to a highlights reel of Gryffindor's Quidditch team. The boos continued, but within Gryffindor the mood flipped. They started chanting and cheering, "We are the champions." Their recent victory had everyone excited all over again. Dumbledore rose to speak, but before he could, Fred and George bolted from the table. The crowd surged after them. In the scramble, the twins failed to escape retaliation. Students who had been pranked and those who had merely laughed seized their chance. Professor McGonagall, surprisingly, did not intervene. Dumbledore watched with an amused expression as the scene played out. When the chaos subsided, the twins looked a pitiable sight. Antlers sprouted from their heads, their ears lengthened strangely, their faces were darkened, leeks stuck out of their nostrils, and two long front teeth protruded comically. The hall erupted in laughter again. Even some of the professors tried to hide small smiles. Fred and George clambered to their feet, wiping fake tears and making exaggerated bows. At last, the laughter died down. Dumbledore stood. "First, I thank Messrs. Weasley for the joyful moments they have provided us." He waved his wand. A soft white light descended, and immediately the transformations melted away. Fred and George straightened, bowed extravagantly to Dumbledore, and the headmaster inclined his head in return. "Another school year has ended," he continued, looking around the hall. "I will now announce the recipient of this year's House Cup." Dumbledore flicked his wand, and Ravenclaw banners unfurled over the hall. "Congratulations, Ravenclaw!" Pandemonium broke out on their table. The Ravenclaws who had been pretending indifference now threw off their restraint. Hats soared to the ceiling and food appeared in generous piles before them. They applauded and cheered, utterly pleased. Eddie bit into a chicken leg, grease on his fingers, but grinning. "I hope Professor Black stays on as defense against the dark arts next year." Roger rolled his eyes. "He's an assistant." "I know," Eddie said, "but I prefer the Black who competes with Snape about who can deduct the most points." Scott glanced at the staff table. Sirius and Lupin were whispering to each other. Whether either would continue teaching next term was uncertain. After the trials of the year and their connections with the Order of the Phoenix, Dumbledore might decide it wasn't wise to place them in such a risky post again. As for the future of the defense position, Scott couldn't really predict it anymore. The magical world had changed too much for the old expectations to hold. After dinner, Scott and his roommates gathered in the common room to talk about summer plans. "This summer, I'm going to the United States with my dad," Eddie said. "I'm hoping to meet some American wizards. Of course, I'll bring you all back gifts." "If you knew the rules in the American magical world, you wouldn't get your hopes up," Roger said, skeptical. Eddie waved him off. "Who knows? The British magical world isn't exactly in great shape right now." "I'm going abroad too," Milton said. "To Vienna. I want to travel and look for more music, and maybe find where my mother is." "That's new," Scott said, surprised. "When did you decide that?" "Recently," Milton replied. "Now that my musical talent's back, I want to get out and see the world." Scott patted Milton on the shoulder. "Be careful. I hope you find your mother." "Thank you." The next morning, they took the Hogwarts Express and arrived at King's Cross at noon. Scott said goodbye to Luna on platform 9 3/4 and happened to meet her father, Mr. Lovegood, an eccentric wizard. Once off the platform, he parted ways with his three roommates and, accompanied by Professor Flitwick, went to Heathrow. That afternoon, Scott stepped out of Barajas Airport in Madrid. "Scott," someone called. His cousin Ramiro waved from across the arrival hall. "Cousin." Scott walked toward him with a smile. 407. The first day of summer vacation. "We meet again at last." Ramiro greeted Scott with a bear hug, still enthusiastic. "How have you been?" "Long time no see." Scott smiled. "Is everyone doing well?" "Everyone's great, and of course, everyone misses you." Ramiro patted Scott's back as he led him toward the car. "Is the magical world too isolated? I don't think it's good that you can't contact family often." Scott didn't tell him that, for safety reasons, he rarely contacted his family. He only said, "I'll graduate in 2 years." "And after graduation?" Ramiro asked. "Will you live in the Muggle world?" Scott thought for a moment. "I don't know yet. It'll depend on how things are in the magical world then." The truth was harsher. After Hogwarts, he would probably enter a dangerous period, and to avoid endangering his family, he would likely have to stay away. For now, he didn't want to dwell on it. In the car, Ramiro peppered him with questions about life at Hogwarts. Scott obliged, sharing amusing stories and anecdotes. Ramiro listened with obvious delight. By the time they reached the villa in the Salamanca district, the whole family was waiting at the door. Emilia and Michael, Uncle Caleb and Aunt Flora, his cousins Ramos and Adelina. Emilia was the first to rush out and hug him. "Oh, my dear son." She kissed his cheek fiercely. "I missed you so much." "Mom." Scott felt a little embarrassed, but mostly happy. He hugged her back. "I missed you too." "You've grown a bit taller, darling." Emilia kept looking up at him as if she couldn't get enough. "Of course, you're almost 16. "Soon," Scott said with a smile. Emilia nodded, already planning. "We'll celebrate your birthday together next month." She finally let him go and led him to the others. Scott greeted everyone quickly. Even the normally stern Uncle Caleb softened. Aunt Flora fussed over him like always, grabbing his hand, asking questions, unaware that Scott was a wizard. She kept grumbling that Emilia and Michael hadn't managed to get him transferred to a school in Madrid. Eventually, Aunt Flora released him and hauled Emilia and Adelina off to prepare dinner. 5 small children, the offspring of Ramos and Adelina, clustered around, full of questions about Britain. Since the Hill family had once lived there, the kids were endlessly curious about the old country. Scott patiently entertained them, answering their barrage of questions until dinner finally began, and he could breathe. "You're amazing," Ramiro said afterward. "I couldn't spend that long with them. I'd go mad." "That's why they don't like you much," Adelina remarked elegantly, rolling her eyes. After dinner, the relatives said their goodbyes and left, until only Scott and his parents remained. Emilia pulled him back to the sofa and wanted every detail about Hogwarts. Michael listened, quiet and thoughtful. Scott stuck to his rule of reporting only the good parts, avoiding anything sensitive. Emilia smiled, and then, as she listened, tears welled up. "I've always been so worried about you," she choked. "I'm afraid you'll be bullied, that you'll get hurt, that bad things will happen." Scott soothed her. "You underestimate your son, Mom. At Hogwarts, apart from the professors, no student can beat me." He said it in a light, comforting way. "I don't pick fights. The professors are amazing wizards. I learn from them." Emilia relaxed a little. Michael said nothing, but when their eyes met, Scott knew his father wasn't as easily reassured. Sure enough, that night, after Emilia had fallen asleep, Michael knocked on Scott's door. "Is Mom asleep already? I knew you'd be here." Scott, in pajamas, hadn't gone to bed yet. "I've been waiting for you, Dad." They stepped out onto the wide balcony and sat in wicker chairs. Michael lit a cigarette and took a drag. "Looks like you've been through a lot again," he said. "How can you tell?" Scott asked. "As an antiques dealer who used to be a smuggler, I've seen a lot of people," Michael said. "Besides, you're my son." "You don't have to be proud of the smuggling," Scott teased. Michael laughed. "That's the trollop past, son. You can't run from it." "I'm not trying to," Scott said, then fell silent. Michael reached out and mussed his hair. "You can hide things from Millie, but not from your father. Tell me everything. Only by knowing can I be prepared." Scott understood. His father didn't know magic, but he dealt with enough strange characters to recognize danger. Scott started from the incident last summer and recounted the events of the past year in careful detail. Michael listened patiently, occasionally pointing out places where Scott might have done better. They talked until the first light of dawn. "My boy," Michael said finally, looking at him with a complicated expression. "Your life sounds like a Hollywood fantasy adventure. Trouble seems to find you. Even old legends pop up around you." Scott shrugged. "Sometimes it doesn't feel real." "Fortunately, you haven't been defeated," Michael said, tousling his hair again, "and you don't shrink from danger." Scott braced as his hair was turned into a bird's nest. What could he do when it was his father's hand? Michael fell silent for a moment, then spoke more seriously. "But as a parent, I can't just watch you face everything alone." Scott looked at him. Michael's face was half hidden in cigarette smoke. Scott began to say something, then held back. "I know what you want to say," Michael continued. "Millie and I are your parents, but we're Muggles. Muggles can't take part in wizard affairs. You probably think I just need to protect myself and Millie, right?" Scott said nothing. Michael stood up. "Get some rest. I need time to think. We'll talk later." He patted Scott's head, left the balcony, and closed the door. Scott watched him go, then sat motionless for a long time. He sighed, rubbed his face, and felt the sadness Michael had tried to hide. Some things couldn't be changed. He couldn't turn his parents into wizards, nor let them join his dangerous life. Though their love overlapped, the two worlds only intersected at the edges now. Scott trusted his father to be cautious. Michael knew that reckless interference wouldn't help. Cruel as it was for a parent, it was the truth. Exhausted, Scott crawled into bed and slept until something tugged at his ear. "Scott, my dear son." Amelia's voice floated in, and a hand plucked his ear. Half asleep, Scott opened one eye to see his mother at the bedside. "Good morning, Mom," he mumbled. "I want to sleep a little longer." "It's noon, my son." Amelia yanked his ear mercilessly. "And you haven't explained what happened on the balcony. Has my good boy learned to smoke?" "I counted. Did you smoke a whole pack last night?" "Dad smoked them," Scott said, pulling free and burying himself under the covers. "Your father said he didn't come to my room." Amelia pulled back the blankets and sniffed. "Dear, your pajamas stink of smoke." She slapped his bottom hard. Scott finally opened his eyes. He stared at Amelia's angry face and realized he'd been set up by Michael. To stop Amelia from answering for herself, he pleaded, "I won't do it again, Mom." "You'd better not." Amelia pinched his cheek. "I don't want you copying Mike. Your father was a dropout and a hooligan at your age." "I won't smoke again," Scott promised. Amelia finally relented. "Where's Mike?" "He left early this morning," she said. "Oh, and we haven't told you yet. We opened another shop just down the street." Scott swung his legs out of bed. "Go shower, then sort out your own lunch," Amelia ordered. "I'll wash your pajamas and sheets, and I'll clean the balcony. You stinky boy, your room reeks." He took her criticism to heart and obediently showered, changed, and cooked himself a steak for lunch. Afterwards, he called Roger to check on Milton, who had gone abroad alone. "Milton's gone," Roger said. "I took him to the airport this morning and taught him to fly solo." "Is he all right?" Scott worried. "I keep picturing some British boy crying on a street in Vienna in the papers." Roger admitted he had the same uneasy image. But there was nothing to do but hope Milton would be fine. Later, Scott followed Amelia's instructions to the new shop. It was another trollopy antique store on a quiet, narrow street. He pushed open the door and the brass bell chimed. The interior was nearly identical to their Hastings shop. The same clutter of curios, an old gramophone playing a decades-old record, and behind a worn counter sat Michael, impeccably dressed and drinking coffee. He looked perfectly alert, as if he hadn't stayed up all night. "You're here," he said. "Dad, is there any business here?" Scott asked, glancing around, suspecting Michael had opened the place more for fun than profit. Michael smiled and waved him over. 408. Towers that extend to the center of the earth. Scott walked between the cramped shelves to the counter, looked around, and swung up onto a high stool. Michael set his coffee down, produced a string of keys from his pocket, and used a copper key to open a drawer hidden behind the counter. From it, he took a carved wooden box studded with a few gemstones and placed it on the counter. Scott leaned forward. The box looked very old, and even the gems were dusty. "This is," he began. "It's not the box that matters," Michael said, producing a very small golden key from the ring and unlocking the box. "It's what's inside." He opened the lid and turned the box so Scott could see. Inside lay tattered sheets of parchment. "Remember the parchment you gave me for Christmas 2 years ago? I found more like it," Michael said. Scott froze, then smiled. "Thank you, Dad. I like them." Michael brushed off the gratitude. "Let's see whether they're actually useful. Last time we got lucky with something connected to a wizard. Luck doesn't always hold." Scott nodded and, with care, lifted the fragile ancient parchments out of the box. He rifled through them and found a strip of animal hide tucked among the sheets. He spread it out on the counter. "This is from a wizard," he said. The hide was covered in ancient runes, clear even at a glance. Michael smiled. "Looks like it wasn't for nothing." He added, "Oh, and this hide came from Britain. It was a bit of a hassle to get, but I haven't lost my old contacts." Scott could picture the trouble his father had gone to. There was no need for more thanks between them. He simply shook the hide gently and said, "I'll put it to good use." Michael understood. "That's all I can do for now. If you need anything hard to get, tell me. Your uncle can help too." "I understand," Scott said, staring at the hide. He decided to translate it first, while he had free days. Ancient runes were more than magical script. They could be straightforward text, but their meanings could be layered. He returned home after saying goodbye to Michael, greeted Amelia, and went straight to his study. He took 2 reference books, Runes Dictionary and Advanced Runes Translation, from his shape-changing lizard skin bag and began to work. Ancient rune documents weren't rare in the magical world, and many turned out to be mundane. Old diaries, worthless ramblings, archaeological curiosities rather than recipes for magic. Truly valuable finds, like the parchment he had once obtained that contained the alchemy formula for the Ring of Arson, were exceptional. So Scott didn't expect much. As he translated, his casual attitude shifted. The hide didn't contain spells or runic circuits, but it did chronicle an ancient wizard's expedition into an old ruin, an account that gripped him. The title caught his eye: The Silent Land, the tower extending to the Earth's core. The record made the venture sound lethal. 7 set out, 1 returned. The account listed the fates. 1 died by fire, 1 drowned, 1 perished in the treetops, 1 fell at the base of the tower, 1 was crushed by falling rocks, 1 swallowed by ground collapse. It went on to say that 6 had been felled by curses, and the sole survivor could never escape the shadow of death for the rest of his life. Ancient runes expressed ideas differently from modern tongues. Many words carried multiple meanings, so Scott could only be sure of most of the text. To fully understand the events, or to determine whether this was an eyewitness account or a legend, he would need help. He also needed to confirm whether the story referred to a real place. He took a small blank picture frame from his bag, set it upright on the table, and tapped its edge 3 times with his wand. "Respected mentor, your apprentice requests your aid." A graceful, noble figure slowly appeared on the blank canvas within the frame. She looked around in curiosity. "Is this your home in the Muggle world? Has Muggle life changed so much after 1,000 years?" Scott didn't interrupt. After a beat, she looked at him. "What made you call me?" "My father, a Muggle antique dealer, found another ancient wizard's document in the Muggle world. I'm having trouble with parts of it." Scott held up the animal hide. Ravenclaw glanced at it, and her expression shifted. "The tower extending to the Earth's core?" she murmured. Unlike Scott, who had to translate line by line, she understood the general content at a glance. "I've heard that legend," she said softly. "All wizards of my time knew of it." Scott hadn't expected that. "So this hide has been preserved for over 1,000 years. Is this a real account or merely legend?" "I can't say for sure yet." Ravenclaw examined the hide again. "But its details are more complete than any version of the legend I know." Scott pointed to a passage. "According to this, we can even locate the tower, except it sounds horribly dangerous." Ravenclaw nodded. "An expedition with no clear gain is pointless." They agreed. Scott wouldn't risk such a place without knowing what he might gain. "I've transcribed it," Ravenclaw said. "I'll consult your professors and see whether we can find corroborating records elsewhere." "All right. Enjoy your holiday, my apprentice." Ravenclaw smiled and faded back into the frame. Scott read on. The document marked the location, the northernmost isles, presumably the Shetlands, and specifically on the day of longest daylight, where the shadow of the standing stones points. The standing stones must be the Stennis stones on mainland. Mainland held many relics of ancient civilizations, Skara Brae, Maesho, and the Stennis standing stones, but Scott had no desire to travel there now. He put the hide away and left the study. For the next few days, Scott relaxed by playing games at home. He did so until Amelia could no longer stand it. "Darling, you need to go out more instead of staying cooped up all the time," she scolded one afternoon. "Your Aunt Flora says Ramiro never stays home in summer, but you never go out. I'd rather you be like him, getting out and enjoying yourself." Scott put down his controller and looked at his mother in the doorway. "Where should I go? I don't have any friends in Madrid." "Why don't you go with your cousin Ramiro? You've turned down his invitations before." "Alcohol, parties, girls," Scott said helplessly. "I'm not interested in that stuff." Amelia's eyes widened. "You're only 16, darling. You should be interested in girls." "I am interested in pretty girls," Scott said, "but I don't have anything to talk to them about." If he wanted a girlfriend, he'd prefer a witch with shared interests, not an ordinary girl with none. Amelia sniffed. "You said it's a party with alcohol. Who's going to have a sincere conversation there?" Scott laughed and flopped onto the floor. "Oh, so now you're teaching me how to be a bad boy, Mom." She sat cross-legged beside him and touched his face. "I just want you to relax a little. I've always thought Hogwarts made you grow up fast." "Why do you say that?" he asked. She tapped his forehead. "You matured too quickly, like you skipped adolescence and became an adult." "Maybe it's the magic," Scott grinned. "Anyway, it's summer. Time to relax." Amelia pulled at his cheek. "I've already called Ramiro. He'll pick you up after dinner." "Oh, give me a break." Scott covered his eyes. "Fine. Fine." Amelia didn't let him argue. "I'll pick out an outfit for you." Scott had discovered 2 days earlier that Amelia had bought him a mountain of new clothes while he'd been away. Flashy things, some of which no longer fit now that he'd grown. Yesterday, she'd gone shopping again with Aunt Flora and come home with more. Scott stood and went to the walk-in closet. It was divided into 3 areas. Amelia's clothes, shoes, and hats took most of it, but there was a surprising number of Scott's items too, far more than Michael's. "Try this on. This or this." Amelia held up 2 shirts like a practice shop assistant. "Since I'm going out with Ramiro, I don't need to wear a button-down, right?" Scott said. "I'll be casual. A t-shirt's better." "T-shirt?" Amelia hesitated but agreed. She brought out several t-shirts and polo shirts in different colors. Scott pointed to a white t-shirt with a blue print. "Isn't that too plain?" Amelia asked. "It's summer," Scott said. "You don't need to overdo it." "All right," she said, but then brightened. "I'll pair it with good pants and shoes. Accessories are essential." Amelia fussed and produced several outfits to go with the white t-shirt, making him try each one on. Scott surrendered, adopting the mindset of dressing to please your parent. After several changes, Amelia clapped her hands. "What should I do? Every outfit looks so good, as expected from my clothes and my son." She decided the first outfit was best. Scott sighed and put it on, then sat in front of the mirror as Amelia styled his hair with unabashed enthusiasm. 409. Students from Beauxbatons. After dinner, Ramiro arrived in his car. He swaggered into the house, greeted Amelia and Michael, and laughed when he saw Scott. "Not bad. Rare to see you dressed up," he said, patting Scott's shoulder and picking at the silver necklace around his neck. "Looks like you're ready for tonight." He winked. "Trust me, you won't be disappointed." Scott glanced at Amelia, who smiled with obvious satisfaction. He didn't want to explain anything. "I'm taking you to a bar tonight," Ramiro said once they were in the car. "You should thank me properly, cousin. Usually I'm the one picking up girls in situations like this." "Last summer didn't teach you anything, did it?" Scott retorted. "And don't forget, I'm underage." Ramiro's expression twitched as if remembering, then he shrugged. "Girls are wonderful. Also," he added, eyeing Scott, "no matter how anyone asks, you must say you're already 18. "Got it." Scott wasn't excited about going to a bar, but he went along. Ramiro boasted and promised a good time, but once they arrived, he bought 2 drinks, then ghosted off with his own glass. Scott didn't need someone to entertain him. He was more interested in tasting his first strong drink. The bar was noisy, but he found a quiet corner and enjoyed the calm. Not long after, he felt the presence of magic in the room. He turned and met a pair of brown eyes, a boy about his age. Their gazes locked, the boy smiled, and Scott nodded before looking away. The boy, however, walked straight over and sat beside him. "Hi," the boy said. "I'm Lucio, 7th year at Beauxbatons." Scott answered. "6th year at Hogwarts." "Oh, Hogwarts." Lucio's face lit up with curiosity. "Are you from Britain?" Scott nodded, and they began to talk about their schools. Scott was curious about Beauxbatons too. Lucio, while not as loudly chatty as some people, loved to talk about his school. "We even have alchemy here as a special subject. Beauxbatons was founded with funding from the famous alchemist Nicholas Flamel." He kept the conversation going, and Scott only needed to steer it sometimes. Lucio peppered him with questions about Hogwarts. "Dumbledore is famous, isn't he? Does he teach you? What's Hogwarts' most famous class?" "No, Professor Dumbledore doesn't teach us," Scott said. He hesitated about the next answer. The most famous course at Hogwarts was Defense Against the Dark Arts, notorious for its rotating professors thanks to Voldemort's curse. It sounded awkward to mention to someone from another school, so he said more generally, "Hogwarts is comprehensive. We don't really have one single specialty. Our professors are all excellent." Lucio's face fell a little. "Sorry, Dumbledore is just so famous. I thought Hogwarts would have some enviable specialty." Scott felt a small prick of irritation. Hogwarts educates students of many talents to the highest standard. Lucio laughed and apologized, waving his hands. After a moment, he changed tone and became more serious. "Actually, I know you. Scott Trollope." Scott raised an eyebrow. "Oh? I have a cousin at Hogwarts, a third-year Hufflepuff. I've heard him talk about you and even seen a picture." Lucio's freckles stopped dancing as he spoke. Scott feigned nonchalance. That explained why Lucio had recognized he was a wizard and started the conversation. But Lucio wasn't there just for small talk. He pulled a golden card from his pocket. "This is why I came to find you." Scott looked at it. "The Scholar Alliance?" he said, surprised. "You're in it too?" Lucio's surprise was obvious. "How did you find out?" "You don't know?" Lucio asked, astonished. Scott shrugged and said quietly, "I haven't deeply researched the Book of Prometheus since joining the Scholar Alliance." Lucio's eyes widened. He had expected Scott to be unfamiliar with it. "This is the Scholar Alliance," Lucio said, enthusiastic. "You can get anything from the Knowledge Bank." Scott swirled his glass. "What I want doesn't need the Knowledge Bank. I'm a student. What I want is knowledge, and Hogwarts library and professors satisfy me." Lucio didn't look convinced. "Still, the Book of Prometheus has useful little functions. For example, it can detect others nearby who carry a book. You can spend academic credits to raise your authority in the Knowledge Bank." Scott mentally filed that away and decided he would no longer carry the book. "Thanks," he said, raising his glass. "By the way, Scott, my cousin." Ramiro's voice interrupted from across the room. "Why are you over here talking to a boy? Didn't you see that group of gorgeous girls?" He strolled up, leaned on the bar, and peered at Scott and Lucio. "This is Lucio, a wizard. This is my cousin, Ramiro." "Oh, hello, Lucio." Ramiro blinked, then patted Scott on the shoulder. "What a coincidence. Have fun. I'll find you later." Ramiro slipped away. Lucio watched him go and said, "Is your cousin a muggle?" "That's right," Scott answered. "But a wizard's relatives can know some things about the magical world. It doesn't break the statute of secrecy." Lucio conceded the point, then launched into another pitch for the Scholar Alliance. "Use your Book of Prometheus well. It can help you a lot." Scott accepted some of it, but grew more convinced the book was trouble. He didn't want to get too involved in the Scholar Alliance. He steered the conversation toward alchemy instead. Since Lucio had joined the Alliance, he clearly had talent. When the subject switched to alchemy, his eyes lit up and he talked nonstop. Scott enjoyed this focused exchange. Lucio had insights that genuinely helped him, and Scott, who had picked up alchemy knowledge through Ravenclaw, surprised Lucio in turn. Their conversation became lively and productive. Before leaving, Lucio shook the golden card. "I'll contact you again," he promised. Ramiro soon returned. "You wasted a beautiful night talking about magic with another wizard," he complained, baffled. "It's like talking calculus with a male classmate all night at a bar, boring and weird." Ramiro's analogy left Scott speechless. "Can you take a taxi home?" Ramiro winked and nodded toward the bar. "Your cousin still has adult activities." "Yes," Scott said. He said goodbye, hailed a cab, and went home. His parents were still up. Amelia, who had been watching TV, looked at him with a knowing expression. "Oh, you're back. Didn't you have fun?" She stood up, as if she'd planned for him not to come home. Scott felt both helpless and amused. "It wasn't for me," he said shortly. "I'm going to shower." He could have told Amelia about meeting a wizard at the bar and talking magic all night, but Ramiro's comparison made him decide not to. He suspected Amelia would think the same way as Ramiro. Scott noticed how similar the aunt and cousin could be. Over the next few days, he sank back into a quiet routine. He declined Amelia's nagging and Ramiro's invitations. He still had the Ravenclaw portrait to converse with and devoted most of his time to study. He hadn't heard from Lucio through the Book of Prometheus. Mr. Bode had apparently restricted Scott's permissions so that, beyond his introducer, others couldn't search for him. At the end of June, that changed. Scott's Book of Prometheus delivered a letter from Bill Weasley. He was surprised Bill was in the Scholar Alliance, and even more surprised when he read the message. Mr. Bode had been taken into custody by Arthur Weasley, and Bill had been asked by Professor Dumbledore to keep an eye on him at the Ministry. Dumbledore had arranged for Bill to be Scott's introducer in the Alliance. Bill didn't go into details. He said Professor Dumbledore would explain when Scott met him. With Bill's introduction, Scott's book finally activated its basic permissions. Lucio's message arrived soon after, asking to continue their alchemy discussion. Scott put it off for now. He was still thinking about Bode's sudden fall. He'd wanted to go straight to Hogwarts and ask Dumbledore, but Dumbledore had already intervened, so Scott held back. He hadn't been following British political intelligence, but Luna's interpretation of the Thestral prophecy before the summer holidays nagged at him. If the Ministry was about to change a minister, something bigger could be coming. After weighing it all, Scott decided to keep his distance and stick to his plan to return to Britain for the Quidditch World Cup finals. He picked up his pen and began to write back to Lucio. Later, Lucio asked him, "Do you want to visit the Wizarding Street in Spain?" 410. Barcelona Wizard Street. Scott accepted Lucio's invitation and decided to visit the Wizarding Street in Spain. Out of caution, he didn't reveal his home address. They agreed to meet at the entrance to the bar where they had first met. On the day, Scott took a taxi to the bar and saw Lucio standing in front of a black sedan, waving. "Good morning, Scott." "Good morning, Lucio. Thanks for inviting me." After Scott got into the car and thanked him again, he noticed something odd. The driver wasn't human. "You noticed?" Lucio said, a little proud. "This is my alchemical work." He tilted his chin and addressed the driver. "Juan, Aish de Luke Street." "Understood, master." The voice was mechanical. The car started smoothly and slid into traffic. From a casual glance, no one would have realized the driver was anything but human. Scott used his magic sense to probe Juan's structure and couldn't help exclaiming, "Amazing. You're more talented than I thought, Lucio." Lucio shrugged modestly, though the smile on his face betrayed him. "It's nothing special. Juan only reacts mechanically to his surroundings and performs set motions. He isn't truly intelligent." Scott raised an eyebrow. "You've studied Muggle science, haven't you?" "I don't let any interesting knowledge go to waste," Lucio replied. "Muggle experiments with robots and artificial intelligence inspired me a lot." Unprompted, Lucio began to talk about his background. "Like you, I come from a Muggle family. Both my parents are university professors. My mother's British." He mentioned a cousin, Gavin Palty, but Scott shook his head. He couldn't remember every Ravenclaw, let alone a Hufflepuff. The conversation turned back to alchemy. Lucio's enthusiasm was obvious. "I once met Nicholas Flamel. He gave a class at Beauxbatons in my first year. It was the only time. He's gone now." "Is alchemy a compulsory subject at Beauxbatons?" Scott asked. "No, it's an elective from the third year on," Lucio said. "It requires a solid foundation. Not every young wizard has the knack for it." Outside Madrid, the car sped away from the city. "The Spanish Wizarding Street isn't in Madrid?" Scott asked. "It's in Barcelona," Lucio said casually. Scott arched an eyebrow. Madrid and Barcelona were well known for their rivalry. "Why Barcelona?" "More wizards gather there." Lucio shrugged. "Maybe because the royal family is in Madrid. I'm not sure. Spain doesn't have many wizards, no homeschool either, so those with magical lineages tend to congregate in Barcelona. Scott nodded. No wonder Lucio had gone to Bobahuns. He also remembered Madrid and Barcelona were about 600 kilometers apart. Driving would take time. He wondered if he could turn back, but Lucio leaned back and smiled. "Oh, I know what you're thinking." He looked to the driver. "Juan, accelerate." "Yes, master." The car lurched forward. Scott's back slammed into the seat as the scenery outside blurred. "As an alchemist, how could I not tinker with my car?" Lucio said, pride in his voice. "This is my doing." Scott glanced at him. "In Britain, this sort of thing would break the ministry's rules." "It would here too," Lucio grinned. "But don't worry, the car is invisible to Muggles now, and the Spanish ministry can't detect it either." Scott smiled despite himself. He didn't much care whether it was lawful. He preferred spending less time on the road. Lucio's modifications weren't as dramatic as Britain's night bus, but they reached the outskirts of Barcelona in an hour. The car slowed. "Once we're in the city, we have to go normal speed," Lucio explained. "We could be spotted by other wizards." He began to describe the place they were heading to. Muggles call it Luke Street, or the Wizarding Street. It was named after a local who claimed to read fortunes and heal with herbs. Luke. He wasn't a real wizard, but the Muggles worshipped him. "So that violates the statute of secrecy?" Scott said. Lucio smiled. "He used herbs for cures and stones for divination. Muggles thought him magical. Later, various male and female wise folk, gypsies, Catalans, gathered there. None of them were actual wizards. The real wizarding community had already been using the place long before Luke. The Muggle authorities kept the street's name and appearance deliberately." The car stopped near the alley. Scott and Lucio stepped out and walked toward the narrow lane known to Muggles. It was more an alley than a street, too tight for cars, flanked by tall buildings that blocked the sun. Despite the summer heat above, the alley was cool and damp, the ground moist. Lucio gestured at the walls and tiles. "People have all kinds of explanations for the dampness. Some blame underground moisture. Some say the narrowness prevents evaporation. Others say it's magic." "What's the real reason?" Scott asked. "You'll see." Lucio smiled. Scott looked around. The street signs were odd, twisted, distorted fonts that looked like a cross between clusters of insects and magical runes. "They're written in Catalan," Lucio said. Scott also noticed house numbers. Each digit was stylized and incomplete, designed to look mysterious. They reached an old apartment building. A sleepy, bald manager in the lobby half opened his eyes at them and then drifted back. "He's a wizard from the Spanish ministry, assigned to guard the place," Lucio whispered. Scott felt the other man's magic signature and kept his gaze low. They passed a row of elevators, turned corners, and took a stairwell down. Lucio confirmed what Scott suspected. The real Wizarding Street was underground. They descended into a huge underground parking garage. It was vast and empty, dim lights flickering, the floor puddled, concrete pillars lining the space. "This isn't for Muggles," Lucio said as their voices echoed. "That staircase had a Muggle-repelling charm. The setup is to prevent accidental Muggle intrusion." They walked between pillars and began to hear voices. Two witches in robes emerged carrying paper bags, chatting cheerfully about a bargain. The moment they saw Lucio and Scott, they stopped and stared at the boys' Muggle clothes. Lucio, dressed simply, passed inspection, but Scott's outfit, picked by Amelia and a touch too fashionable, stood out in the damp gloom. "Muggles?" one of the witches whispered. "No, we're wizards," Lucio said with a smile. They scanned them a few more times, then went on. Scott heard them murmur, "Is wearing Muggle clothes a trend now?" He glanced down at his outfit and felt slightly ridiculous. As they moved deeper, more wizards looked at them, their attention following Scott. "I feel like a Muggle who wandered into the wizarding world," he muttered. Lucio laughed. Around another row of pillars, a rough stone wall came into view with a crooked security booth outside. Inside, another wizard dozed. "This is the entrance," Lucio said. "We'll go through." He stepped forward and walked through the stone wall as if it were mist. Scott followed, passing through the wall. After a moment of darkness, his eyes opened to bright light and a bustling scene. The Wizarding Street spread before him, bathed in sunshine, with packed buildings and countless shops, like Diagon Alley, but with a river weaving through it. Stone bridges of every style arched over the water, and small boats drifted along the current. "Now you know why the alley above is always damp," Lucio said, pointing to the river. "There's a hidden underground river here." He tapped the sky with a grin. "And the sky is fake. The Ministry has cast a weather charm to simulate the sun and clouds." Scott looked up. "Like the Great Hall's enchanted ceiling at Hogwarts, or the windows at the British Ministry." "Seems wizards everywhere like that," Lucio said. They walked to a small pier. Lucio negotiated with a white-haired old wizard who rented boats. He fiddled with the brass rudder at the bow, the little boat swayed, and it began to glide away on its own, navigating the network of waterways through Barcelona's secret wizarding street. 411. Zugarramurdi thrift store, ding dong, ding dong. The copper bells hung from the boat's high, arched bow and chimed without cease. The small, bright orange wooden skiff cut through the slow, clear water. Scott had a tiny lizard perched on his shoulder as he sat at the stern, staring down into the river. Soft aquatic plants swayed on the riverbed, and tiny points of light winked among them, dreamlike and magnificent. For a moment it felt as if they were floating through a river of stars. "That's a magical creature that only lives in this Olavida river," Lucio said, turning and leaning against the bow. "They're glowfish," he added, tapping the boat's side. "They have bioluminescent organs on their heads. They can absorb and store different kinds of light, but direct sunlight will kill them." "So they have to live in underground rivers?" Scott asked, nodding as he understood. "The Ministry forbids wizards from catching them without a permit," Lucio said. "If you want one, I can take you to a pet shop. You'll need a special tank to keep them alive. I'd put it on your desk. They can act like a lamp to some extent." Scott smiled politely. "Thanks, but I don't want that sort of pet." Lucio shrugged, not surprised. He moved on to point out the many shops lining both banks. The merchandise looked much like what Scott had seen in Britain's Diagon Alley. The differences were mostly architectural. Here, the underground river snaked between buildings, and many shops had display windows that opened onto the water so wizards could browse from small boats. Lucio seemed to enjoy being a guide. He wasn't pushy about shopping, just chatty and eager to show Scott around. "Oh, I need to stop at this second-hand shop," Lucio said suddenly, steering the boat toward a little dock beneath a stone bridge. Scott followed him ashore without objection. The shop stood small and sullen under the bridge. A warped wooden sign read Zugarramurdi Junk Shop, hanging by rusty chains on a mossy wall. The door was swollen and cracked, dark stains clinging to it like old congealed blood. Inside, light was thin. Half-collapsed shelves sagged under clutter, swallowed by shadows. Lucio noticed Scott's hesitation. "I know it looks grim," he said with a grin. "It's a bit creepy, but this is my favorite place. Everything's cheap, and I've found great things here." Scott arched an eyebrow. "You mean you've bought a lot of trash, right?" Lucio laughed, a little embarrassed. "I'll call them necessary expenses." "All right, then." Scott smiled and pushed the door open. Inside felt like a different world. The shop had once had display windows, but dust had made them opaque, and the weak daylight only lit a small patch by the entrance. Dim candles along the stone walls provided the rest of the light. Lucio hustled off, eager to dig through the mess. "Let's hunt separately. See you in a bit," he mouthed. Scott wandered between the shelves. The shop sold everything: battered books, threadbare robes, cracked stationery, a jumble of soiled, neglected things. A stack of old tomes would probably raise a cloud of dust at a touch. The thought was almost suffocating. He was about to move on when Lucio called, "Scott, look at this." Lucio had a nearly broken silver bracelet pinched between two fingers. "Looks like a damaged alchemical piece, but it's too torn up to say what it was used for," he complained. "If it's just a common item, its runic circuit won't do me any good." Scott took the blackened bracelet and let his magic perception run over it. "I can feel a little," he said, "mostly water-related runes and some light. You'd only see the full circuit if an alchemist disassembled and restored it." "That's perfect. I'll buy it." Lucio's eyes lit up. "I don't know many water or light circuits. Our credits never stretch far enough." Scott handed it back. "Beauxbatons doesn't teach you more?" Lucio wrapped the bracelet in his handkerchief. "Only the basics. My family has no alchemy tradition. If we want to advance, we either apprentice with someone or scrape by finding knowledge the hard way." He shrugged with an easy smile. Hey, pick something too. You've got an advantage no one else has. He meant Scott's magic perception, and Scott accepted the nudge. He hadn't realized there were useful secondhand magical items on offer until now. Where Lucio sifted patiently, Scott worked more directly. His refined perception traced the faintest magical fluctuations buried on the shelves. He didn't want everything that thrummed. He selected carefully. Most of the enchanted objects were worthless to him. He'd learned far more in alchemy than the basics, and he didn't need to spend credits at the knowledge bank for rune circuits. He settled on a few things that sparked his interest. A brass scale with a lingering medicinal smell, a mirror that showed only a blurred silhouette, a tiny ring, and, most curious of all, a bronze mariner's astrolabe green with verdigris. The astrolabe looked like a Muggle antique, not something Scott would normally target. He'd almost missed it, but a faint magical flutter told him it might be the best thing in the shop. He picked it up and felt the tug of a potential. He pointed out the other objects to Lucio, who paid without hesitation. Money didn't seem to be a problem for him. They brought the items to the counter in the shop's darkest corner. The proprietor was a tall, gaunt wizard with hollow cheeks, high cheekbones, and hands like desiccated claws. A few gold teeth flashed when he spoke. "I hate customers like you," he said to Scott, eyes narrowing. "Too practical. You miss the fun of gambling." Lucio flashed a charming grin and leaned in. "Oh, boss, I've bought plenty from you before. You used to be more agreeable." The shopkeeper grunted a dry laugh, then sold them the lot without haggling. Scott managed to buy the astrolabe for a single galleon. Whether it was a bargain or not, he was in a good mood. After they left, Lucio insisted on taking Scott to try a local specialty as a thank you for helping choose the items. They ate at a lively riverside place. Scott found Spanish wizard cuisine surprising. Where Muggles used eggs and potatoes, wizard kitchens used snake eggs and omelets. Cold soups that should be tomato-based were spiced with nightshade and sage, tasting more like potions than food. If Lucio hadn't been eating with such enthusiasm, Scott would have suspected a prank. He took a few polite bites, smiled, and set his fork down. Drinks and desserts were ordinary enough, and he left only half satisfied. During the meal, Lucio explained why he'd been so eager to meet Scott. "Gavin told me about you," he said. "Your magic perception and transfiguration are famous at Hogwarts. You're in the Scholar Alliance too, right? Maybe we can talk alchemy sometime." Scott shook his hand. "Nice to meet you." Lucio rattled off a string of middle names before settling on Lucio Gonzalez, and Scott managed to remember only the given name and surname without looking rude. They finished, then took an alchemy-modified carriage driven by an automaton back to Madrid and parted at the bar entrance. Scott got home ravenous and barely answered Amelia's questions before diving into a big meal. Once he'd eaten, he fed the lizards tiny recordings into the magic mirror and showed his parents their trip through Barcelona's wizard quarter. "I thought you went to Venice," Amelia said, staring into the mirror. "This river is beautiful." "Do wizards in every country look that odd?" Michael asked, watching footage of oddly dressed, distorted figures drifting past in boats. Scott shrugged. It was hard to explain. Years of eccentric spellwork, experimental charms, or careless magic could leave a wizard's appearance strange in old age. "Oh no, my son," Amelia said, taking his hand earnestly. "Promise Mama your handsome face won't turn out like that." In the days that followed, Scott kept up his lessons with the Ravenclaw mentor and finished the assignments she set. In his free time at home, he continued investigating the few trinkets he'd impulsively bought from the old junk shop in Zugalamudi. Outwardly, they looked only a bit worn, but each was damaged and had lost whatever original enchantment it once held. Scott could only make rough guesses about their functions. One exception was an exceptionally tiny ring, so small he couldn't get it on any of his fingers. After careful sensing and consulting his references, he discovered that such rings were not unusual. They were nanny rings, used by some wizarding families to protect small children. They weren't powerful. They simply gave gentle protection against falls, bumps, and minor accidents. That explained the size. He set it aside and turned his attention back to the other three items: a mirror, a brass scale, and a mariner's astrolabe. Scott's alchemy was still rudimentary, so he had to rely heavily on his unusually acute magical perception, which made progress slow. Alchemy was an immensely complex, cross-disciplinary art. It relied on ancient runes. The runic circuits formed by intricate combinations of runes were at the heart of an alchemical item's properties, but it also drew on knowledge from potions, herbology, magical creatures, and charms. An alchemist who could engrave a runic circuit but had no idea how to combine magical creatures, minerals, herbs, and other materials, or how to process those materials with potions and charms, wouldn't be able to complete a proper alchemical work. Because the craft was so wide-ranging, different alchemists used different approaches. There was no single standard. The junk shop items were clearly not made by the same hand, and to dismantle them and interpret the runic circuits, Scott would have to understand several different methods and be extremely careful. Brute force cracking was risky. Even traditional alchemical techniques, applied incorrectly, could collapse a runic circuit entirely. He had asked his Ravenclaw mentor for help, but this time, she refused to give direct assistance. "It's the holidays," she told him. "I've adjusted your study plan. You have time to try and decipher them yourself, my apprentice. Go on. Give it a go. Try to have some fun and make progress." Scott agreed readily. Although he hadn't specialized in alchemy, he had his cheat, magical perception. Ever since his perception awakened in his first year at Hogwarts, training and natural growth had strengthened it. Its range expanded, and his sensitivity to subtle magics sharpened. Scott's approach was straightforward. He used perception to feel the nature of the magic in an object, and from that inferred the runic composition. Different ancient runes left distinct signatures in his sense, which helped a great deal. Still, many runes could be represented in multiple ways, and runic circuits required precise combinations, so deciphering demanded patience. He enjoyed it. Decoding the objects was itself a form of learning, and as his mentor had said, it was both fun and instructive. Lucio, who contacted Scott almost daily through the Book of Prometheus, was doing similar work and often more absorbed than Scott. Without Scott's perceptual advantage, Lucio had to rely on conventional methods, and his progress was slower. Bill Weasley and Scott conversed more frequently now that Scott's authority in the knowledge bank had increased. They no longer needed to use letters for every exchange. Bill generously shared findings from his work in Egypt, and Scott reciprocated with updates on his Transfiguration research. Bill had once written a paper on a related idea, and Scott's practical progress gave Bill hope that the theory might not be pure fantasy. Bill couldn't reproduce Scott's uncanny talent, but he offered enthusiastic theoretical help. "This is a remarkable gift. You should be proud. I can't apply it myself, but I'd be honored to offer theoretical assistance." Bill had written, sincere and encouraging in the way only Bill could be. Scott's summer routine also included an indispensable ritual, animagus preparation. He practiced diligently every sunrise and sunset. As time passed, he began to feel a subtle second heartbeat echoing beneath his own, a sign that the transformation was moving forward. Everything was in place. He only needed a storm from the Scottish Highlands to trigger the final change. One afternoon, while Scott was writing a paper in his study, his mother Amelia called up the stairs. "Scott, your phone," she called. "Okay, Mom." He hurried down and took the phone from her. Amelia no longer tried to micromanage his holidays. Michael's persuasion had helped. Michael understood Scott's situation and agreed that his primary task was to get stronger. "Scott!" Roger's voice crackled through the line. "Hey, Roger, did Milton make the papers?" Scott teased. "How did you know?" Roger laughed. "What?" Scott paused, then Roger spilled the news. "Merlin, I'm not joking. Milton's in the papers. Not just local Vienna, British papers too." Relief spread through Scott. Roger's laughter suggested good news. "Let me guess," Scott said. "A famous musician discovered him?" "You guessed right," Roger exclaimed. "It's true. Milton played his original cello piece on the street and captivated a famous musician who happened to pass by. He was discovered." Roger was ecstatic. "Milton's composing and cello playing are mesmerizing. Some people are talking about putting on a concert for him. The British papers covered it today. I think he's become a sensation there." "So our wizard friend is a celebrity in the Muggle world?" Scott said, still amazed. "Exactly," Roger crowed. "Lots of classmates who live in the Muggle world saw it. There's even a photo of Milton in the paper. He rattled off Milton's current address and phone number. Milton called and said he hopes we can come to his concert. I gave him your number. He'll call you soon. Shame Eddie's gone to the States. After hanging up with Roger, Scott let the news sink in and felt happy for Milton. Milton loved music more than magic. Being a world-renowned musician fit his dream better than being a powerful wizard. Scott promised to support his first concert. That afternoon, Milton called. Scott, congratulations, musical prodigy of Britain. Scott laughed and congratulated him. Milton's voice was bright with new confidence, a steadiness Scott had never heard before, like a seed finally breaking through the soil. On the phone, Milton recounted the journey, how the musician had been struck by his playing, how opportunities had opened, how he'd been asked to perform. Scott listened without interrupting, then encouraged him. Milton downplayed the concert as small, still a newcomer, but Scott told him it was a start. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, Milton confessed. I haven't found Mum yet. Maybe if I get famous, she'll see me in the papers. You can do it, Scott said. He could feel Milton's change. It wasn't the hollow growth that came from some bargains or shortcuts, but real maturation. Milton had become confident and driven, with clear goals and the motivation to pursue them. The nickname Scott had joked about, the British Lin Dayu, seemed likely to fade away. Back at his workbench, Scott dove into his research. The next day, Lucio posted an update in the Book of Prometheus. Scott, you wouldn't guess, I deciphered that almost broken silver bracelet, the one you sensed had water and light. I had high hopes. Water and light circuits are rare, but it turned out a disappointment. It's only for beauty. Water to moisturize the skin, light to make one glow. When I finished deciphering it, I felt a bit hopeless. Scott burst out laughing at Lucio's deflated tone. He wasn't surprised. It was an understandable disappointment after high expectations. He wrote back teasingly, offering a practical angle. Don't feel hopeless. You could make a fortune. There are countless witches and wizards who love beauty. Especially our peers. They're always into courting and appearances. Lucio wasn't thrilled by the idea of monetizing the bracelet. He wasn't short of money. He was short of knowledge. After a little thought, Scott struck a deal with him. He traded the runic circuit he'd deciphered from the nanny ring to Lucio in exchange for the bracelet circuit. Lucio didn't want to profit from the beauty bracelet, but Scott spotted a business opportunity. If he handed the bracelet circuit to the Weasley twins and Eddie, they could surely turn it into a tidy sum. On July 13th, Scott turned 16. He had cast a shielding charm over his name at the start of the summer, so his address would remain hidden. As a result, none of his wizarding friends had sent him gifts. That didn't stop the day from being lively. His relatives came that evening and held a joyful party. Everyone brought presents, even the little cousins with their handmade cards, and Scott accepted them all with a grin. Ramiro had joked about inviting friends and pretty girls, but Scott preferred a warm family celebration. It turned out exactly as he liked, simple, full of laughter, and perfectly pleasant. Roger and Milton, knowing the situation, sent their birthday wishes by phone, and even Eddie called from the United States. Late that night, Scott went back to his room. The Ravenclaw mentor waited in the small picture frame on his desk. His owl Shay was perched beside the frame, cocking her head as she regarded the elegant witch in the painting. "Good evening, mentor," Scott said as he sat. "Sorry, I didn't know you were here." "It's all right." The Ravenclaw smiled and inclined her head. "Happy birthday, my apprentice." "Thank you," Scott smiled back. "I'll leave you a gift." When the portrait vanished, the picture frame did not remain empty. A clear, glowing schematic of a magical rune circuit appeared, together with explanatory notes. It was an analysis from Nicholas Flamel's Core of the Knowledge Bank, Alchemy Section, Construction Records. A rune circuit designed to build a long-distance connection between a mother body and a child body, the sort used to link something like a knowledge bank to a derivative object such as the Book of Prometheus. Scott's eyes lit up. He set the frame aside and reached for his notebook and fountain pen, eager to copy the diagram. If he could make use of that circuit, Eddie's idea for a new type of wizarding media company could be realized, and more than that, Scott could combine it with his existing listening and monitoring to create long-distance real-time links and even a pervasive surveillance network. The possibilities made him giddy with plans and strategies. He wanted nothing more than to understand the circuit and put it to work. Shay, however, had other ideas. The owl leaned forward, flexed her neck, and peered at the diagram with big, curious eyes. "All right, Shay," Scott said, half laughing, half exasperated. "You're blocking me." Shay had been out of mail service for some time. Too much lounging, too much sleeping, and she'd grown round and heavy. Scott picked her up and carried her to the windowsill. "You're getting too fat. I think you need flying practice, or I'll tell Mum you should hunt for your own food." Shay pecked his hand in mock protest. Scott set her on the sill. She fluffed out her feathers, fluttered up rather laboriously, and gave him 2 triumphant squawks before disappearing into the night. He sat back down and began meticulously copying the rune circuit. He could already picture how to adapt the design, how to integrate the connection protocols. The more he thought about it, the more he wanted to finish learning it at once. Amelia knocked at the door. "Come in." "You should go to bed, my dear," she said gently. "Okay, Mum." Scott tidied his desk quickly. Amelia's tone was mild but firm. He knew better than to argue. She turned off his bedside light after she saw him in bed and closed the door. But sleep was not what he had in mind. He took the mariner's astrolabe he'd bought at the antique shop out of the drawer and lay back down, intent on probing it with his magic senses. He had already managed to analyze bits of the small mirror and the brass scale. The astrolabe, though, resisted him. Its magical fluctuations were faint and indistinct, almost as if the device had been damaged or hiding its essence. Scott's instinct told him not to give up. He closed his eyes, held the astrolabe on his chest with his right hand, and sank his consciousness inward to track the faintest currents. A warm breeze from the open window brushed his face. Time blurred. His awareness sank deeper and deeper, slipping towards sleep. He didn't fight it. He told himself he could continue in the morning and let sleep take him. The breeze turned cold. He could smell sea air, feel the bite of wind, and hear waves. The bedroom became ice cold. His body felt like it was freezing solid. Panic washed through his sluggish mind. This was wrong, but his limbs were heavy, his eyelids leaden. He felt trapped in a nightmare, consciousness dimming under a suffocating cold. Then he heard wings. Shay. A small, hopeful surge came with the sound. "Coo! Coo!" The owl called. Her beak pecked at his right hand where the astrolabe lay. The pain was sharp enough to break through the freezing fog filling his head. He blinked and opened his eyes. He was somewhere else at once, under a vast, starry sky above a black sea. Glaciers loomed around the horizon. Cold wind howled. He sat shaking on a battered wooden sailboat. He was still in his summer pajamas, barefoot and numb. He staggered into the dark, empty cabin, which smelled of damp wood and rot. A jolt of pain from his finger brought him back with a gasp. He woke again to his own ceiling, to the familiar dim of his bedroom. But the room was in chaos. Everything was floating as if in the middle of one of his uncontrolled magic episodes from childhood. The bed, a pile of clothes, even Scott himself hovered a few inches off the floor. He held his breath and concentrated, tamped down his magic until the objects drifted gently back and landed. Only when his bed thudded to the floor and his back hit the mattress did he let himself exhale. "Thank you, Shay," he said, reaching out to the owl perched on the headboard. Shay gave 2 pleased hoots and turned her head as if she'd done him a favor. She still looked a little put out, though. Scott turned on the bedside lamp and looked at his right hand. Shay's pecking had split the skin of his index finger. A bead of blood stood at the wound and had smeared slightly over the astrolabe. The verdigris-coated brass that had been dull before was now bright and gleaming, as if newly polished. He set the astrolabe down and stared at it, suddenly wary. He knew the trance-like vision had been caused by the astrolabe. The thought of having his consciousness taken over again made him uneasy. He doused the wound with a bottle of Dittany. The bleeding stopped, and the cut knitted itself closed quickly. "I'm fine now," he told Shay, who had been watching him very closely. "Lucky it wasn't a port key," he muttered. If it had been, he might have been stranded in that freezing sea for real. He'd been careless. After the bath, he'd forgotten to put on his forest portkey bracelet. He went to the bathroom, found the silver snake-shaped necklace he'd left on the sink, and looped it around his left wrist. The familiar cold of the silver felt reassuring. Only then did he fall asleep properly. In the morning, he behaved as if nothing had happened. He ate breakfast normally and kept the episode to himself. Michael and Amelia noticed he seemed a little off, but accepted his excuse that he'd been too excited and hadn't slept well. After they left for the shop and housework, Scott summoned his mentor. The Ravenclaw appeared and immediately saw he was troubled. When he told her about the vision and showed the restored astrolabe, she studied it thoughtfully. "In this state, I can't make a definitive judgment," she said. "To analyze something like this properly, I would need the magic available in the room of requirement." Scott wasn't surprised. Portraits in Hogwarts sometimes had access to the room's magic, and this Ravenclaw was no exception. Still, he'd hoped for a quicker answer. "So what do you think it is?" he asked. "There are two likely possibilities," she said. "Either it is an object that attacks or overrides your consciousness, or it is trying to guide you, sending visions to lead you somewhere or to communicate. If it is the latter, you might glean more by attempting communication. But I do not recommend you try that alone. If the object is harmful, interacting with it without support could be dangerous." "I understand," Scott said. He had no intention of risking another episode alone. He put the astrolabe back in the drawer and paid attention to the lesson Ravenclaw gave him, taking careful notes. The next days passed uneventfully until a call from Milton. A small concert he was involved in would be on July 20th. Scott decided to go to support him. Amelia and Michael were fine with him traveling. He booked a flight for the 19th. Roger would fly over from Britain, too. On the 19th, Michael drove him to the airport. Scott boarded the plane bound for Vienna, Austria, carrying the astrolabe tucked safely in his bag and the knowledge that he had a mystery to examine, one he would not face alone. 414. Sightseeing tour in Vienna. At 2 p.m., Scott's Spanish National Airlines flight touched down at Vienna International Airport. As he followed the flow of passengers out of arrivals, he spotted Roger and Milton waiting in a prominent spot, waving. Slinging his backpack over one shoulder, Scott walked briskly toward them. "Long time no see, my friend." Roger spread his arms as if they really had been apart for ages. "Long time no see." Scott hugged him warmly, then turned to embrace Milton. "Congratulations." "Thank you," Milton replied. "Where are we going now? Let's find a hotel near your place," Scott said. "No, come to my rented flat," Milton insisted. "You must." "No problem," Roger agreed. The three of them left the airport, rented a car, and drove back into central Vienna. Milton had to rehearse, so after dropping Scott and Roger at his small apartment, he hurried off. Scott and Roger didn't stay in the flat long. They dropped their bags and went out to see the city. Vienna, on the Danube, is Austria's capital and largest city, a major cultural center in Europe, often called the world capital of music. Before World War I, it had been the capital of the Holy Roman Empire, the Archduchy of Austria, the Austrian Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Its old town is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and there was a long list of places worth visiting. Scott and Roger headed straight for the inner city, the heart of Vienna. They walked along the narrow, cobbled streets, excitement on their faces. The lanes were lined with Baroque, Gothic, and Romanesque buildings, and the medieval spire of St. Stephen's Cathedral and the twin towers of other churches rose above the roofs. "It looks so old, but there's none of that. Magical aura," Scott said with a smile. Roger shrugged. "That's because the religious atmosphere here is very strong." Besides the cathedrals and historic churches, the old city had the Vienna State Opera, Hofburg Palace, the Ringstrasse, jazz bars, ballrooms, and art galleries. They did a fast tour, ate dinner, and didn't get back to Milton's apartment until 9. Milton arrived an hour later, at 10, looking anxious in that familiar way he always did before a big performance. Compared to the old Milton, he'd improved a lot. At least, that's what Roger kept saying while trying to reassure him. Still, Milton couldn't sleep. Scott and Roger stayed up with him, chatting to ease his nerves. "I didn't expect," Scott began, hesitating. Milton had clearly matured, but Scott hadn't expected such a thorough change. Roger thought it was normal. People change. Even in a short time, some things can shift a lot. "Are you two teasing me?" Milton said helplessly. They coughed and quickly changed the subject, moving on to the pieces Milton would perform the next day, compositions he'd written over recent years, most of which Scott and Roger had heard before. They praised him without restraint. "I always knew you were a genius. You'd shine, and now you have. As long as you play like you do in rehearsal, you'll win them over. You've already won over musicians. You'll win everybody. You're the best." Their compliments made Milton smile and roll his eyes. Then a new worry surfaced. "My teacher wants me to apply to the Vienna University of Music." He called the musician who admired him "my teacher," which suggested genuine regard. "Of course, you can apply to any university after you graduate from Hogwarts," Scott said. "But my teacher thinks my current school is a waste of time," Milton admitted awkwardly. "He doesn't know anything about magic or Hogwarts. To him, I'm just at some unknown boarding school." "So are you going to give up the rest of Hogwarts?" Scott asked. Milton shook his head, looking uncertain. "I don't know. You actually thought about giving up? That's Hogwarts," Roger protested. Scott understood better than Roger. "Giving up isn't impossible," he said. "You've already taken your OWLs and should have some certificates. The 6th and 7th years are advanced level work, but the music world is a different path." But Roger still found the idea hard to accept. Scott's tone turned more serious. "For you, music matters more than magic, and the British magical world isn't peaceful right now. Voldemort and Medea's factions are pulling at one another, and the Ministry has become chaotic. Your father, Mr. Greaves, is already deeply involved, caught up in the middle of it." He looked at Milton. "It might be better for you to stay away from Britain for a while." Milton's expression shifted. "I hadn't thought of it that way." "I know," Scott said, "but you could. It's a viable option." Even Roger, listening, nodded. Milton finally said, "I suppose I need to think about it." "Of course," Scott smiled. "It's just my suggestion. Decide after careful thought." The conversation wound on, and for a while Milton's concert anxiety receded as he thought about the future. Scott suddenly remembered something else. "Have you invited Professor Flitwick to the concert? As Dean of Ravenclaw and advisor of the Classical Music Club, his attending would mean a lot. He could also advise you about your choices." "I sent a formal invitation," Milton said, "but I don't know if he'll come." "He likely will, unless he never received it," Scott replied. Milton explained that he'd sent the letter to Roger through the Muggle post and asked Roger to forward it. Roger nodded. "I got that letter yesterday," he said. "I asked my family's owl to deliver it. The professor will receive it. Just wait, he'll praise you tomorrow." "It would be wonderful if he comes," Milton said, smiling at the thought. Just as Scott had expected, Professor Flitwick did not refuse Milton's invitation. That morning, an owl had delivered a letter from the professor. He had written after arriving in Austria from Britain. The three boys hurried to meet him in an old tavern deep in a narrow alley of the old town. Of course, it was a wizarding bar. Following the directions in the letter had been how Scott and his friends first traced signs of magic in the city. "Professor," they called as they entered. "Oh, my students, hello," Flitwick answered, delighted. Though only a short time had passed since they'd last seen him, meeting in a foreign country made the reunion feel unusually warm. The three boys bent down and hugged him. The embrace drew a few curious glances from the other wizarding patrons. Flitwick's cheeks flushed slightly with pleasure. "I am honored and very proud," the professor said to Milton after the hugs. "I've spoken with the local wizards. They told me of your remarkable achievements." He didn't forget Scott and Roger. "And I'm glad to see such sincere friendship," he added, smiling. Roger mentioned casually that Eddie had wanted to come but was in the United States. Flitwick nodded approvingly and offered Eddie praise as well, even though Eddie wasn't there to hear it. Some things were inconvenient to discuss outside a wizarding bar, so they stayed to talk. Flitwick explained how he had come through official ministry channels and suggested that Milton, Scott, and Roger register with the Austrian Ministry of Magic while they were in the country. "You entered by Muggle transport," he advised. "It would be safer and more polite to register, especially if you're staying through the holidays. Wizards entering another country without permission often cause misunderstandings." Scott and Roger hadn't thought of that, but after a quick exchange of looks, they agreed. The professor happily described Innsbruck, where the Austrian ministry was based, a snowbound town in a glacial alpine valley about 400 kilometers from Vienna, full of medieval architecture. He'd come from there via the Flu network. Scott listened with growing curiosity and remembered he'd never formally registered with the Spanish ministry despite spending time in Barcelona. Flitwick reminded him to take care of that when he returned to Madrid. The conversation turned to Milton's concert. Flitwick, a music enthusiast, was eager to hear about it, but Milton had to prepare and kept apologizing for leaving. Flitwick waved him off with indulgent cheer and told him to go. Scott and Roger then accompanied the professor on a short sightseeing tour of Vienna's old town. Flitwick didn't rely on a Muggle-repelling charm, as he would back in Britain. Instead, he used a subtle transfiguration to soften his slightly pointed ears and nose. Even so, his height and manner still drew attention in the crowded streets, which he took in stride. He told them about the etiquette foreign wizards expected and how to handle interactions with other countries' ministries, a lively, practical lecture that both students enjoyed. They explored the old town until after dinner, returned to Milton's flat to change into formal clothes, rented a car, and drove to the concert hall at the Vienna University of Music. The modest hall filled quickly with young musicians and listeners. Scott, Roger, and Flitwick took their seats and opened their programs. Roger, who had been listening quietly, leaned close. "They're all curious about Milton," he murmured. "They want to know why a great musician praised him." "They'll see soon enough," Flitwick said proudly. "I've always known Milton is a genius." Scott frowned and then whispered, "Wizards have entered." He counted by feeling the magical presences. 3 of them. "Where?" Roger wanted to look but held back. Flitwick patted his hand. "Relax, they may be music lovers too." "There are 2 unfamiliar presences and one I recognize. Mr. Greaves," Scott said, surprised. "Milton's father." Both Flitwick and Roger went quiet, their faces tightening. The Greaves family trouble was known to them, and the name carried weight. Scott glanced casually toward the seats and met the gaze of a man whose appearance was unfamiliar enough to be the result of polyjuice or another disguise. Scott was certain it was Mr. Greaves beneath it. Greaves seemed to notice them but gave no sign. He looked at their backs as if they were strangers. Scott dropped his eyes, but his mind was already racing. More unsettling was the woman seated beside Greaves. She trembled and cried, clearly a Muggle, without any trace of magic. Scott's stomach clenched. If she was Greaves's companion, she was certainly not Mrs. Zabini. The sight made Scott think of Milton's mother. If this woman was actually Milton's mother, Greaves had been hiding a great secret. If not, what were they doing? The possibilities made Scott feel that much of Milton's suffering might have been made a mockery. He had to be careful. He didn't want to pry into family affairs, yet Milton was his friend and deserved the truth. Standing by felt wrong too. Roger nudged his elbow. "What's wrong? You look off." "I'll tell you later," Scott said, then wrote a single word on Flitwick's hand with his finger. The professor understood and silently cast a small charm. When Scott leaned close enough to whisper, Flitwick listened as Scott described what he had seen and his suspicions. "Don't jump to conclusions," Flitwick said calmly. "Your guess may be wrong. Let Milton finish his concert. Afterwards, I'll speak with Mr. Greaves." Scott agreed. Flitwick dispelled the charm. Roger, curious but discreet, didn't press. The concert began without fanfare. Milton came on alone in formal attire, bowed, and seated himself. The cello sang out, deep, resonant. The opening piece, Ravenclaw Impression, flowed with a familiarity that dulled Scott's initial reaction, but he watched the audience. Many faces broke into astonished admiration. Milton's performance was breathtaking. He moved through piece after piece with growing confidence. The applause after each selection grew louder. Under the stage lights, he no longer looked flustered. He was entirely in his element. One of the pieces was titled Hidden Mother's Love. The cello mourned and yearned. The music poured out unease, longing, gratitude, and love. The whole hall was moved. Scott felt the music's pull, but could not let go of the tension in his chest. He glanced toward Greaves again. Greaves sat upright and unreadable. The woman beside him sobbed quietly and kept looking back toward the stage. Scott felt an unexpected tide of empathy rising and blinked it away. Milton closed the program with Hogwarts. When the last note faded, he stood and bowed to standing ovations. The audience rose as one. Young musicians swarmed him afterward with breathless praise. He had won them over completely. Scott clapped, elated for his friend, but still worried. As the crowd filed out, Scott searched for Greaves and the woman. Greaves rose and left, supporting the woman's arm. She kept glancing back toward Milton. By the time Scott pushed through the departing audience, they were gone, vanished from sight and beyond the reach of his magical perception. "It's all right. Greaves still has duties at the ministry," Flitwick muttered, a hint of displeasure in his voice. Scott was about to reply when he noticed movement at the edge of his attention. The two unfamiliar magical presences he had noticed earlier were no longer seated. They were gradually approaching. Scott Trollope froze, hand darting for the wand tucked into his pocket. He turned and fixed his gaze on two wizards who were moving through the crowd toward him. Plain clothes, ordinary haircuts, stubble on their chins, perfectly inconspicuous. "What's wrong, Scott?" someone asked. Professor Flitwick had noticed Scott's tension and spun around. "Avada Kedavra!" Two blinding green beams erupted and shot straight for Scott. The attack was deadly and so sudden, he barely had time to think. Yet as the curses launched, Scott registered a familiar shift in the magical signature. The Caro siblings. There was no time to wonder why they had come disguised in a Muggle crowd, why they could mask their magic, or why they would brazenly cast in front of so many Muggles. He only knew he had to save himself. "Scott!" Professor Flitwick and Roger's urgent cries filled the air. The green lights were almost on him, and Scott could not even pull his hand from his pocket in time. He had one choice: activate the portkey. With no hesitation, and just before the light could touch him, he triggered the portkey strapped to his left hand. The world spun in a tunnel of color, and he reappeared in a forest. "Lambo!" he shouted. "Caw!" came the answer. Crows erupted from the surrounding oaks in a harsh, rising chorus. Wingbeats thudded as thousands of black birds took to the air, blotting the sky. From the largest oak, Lambo swooped down. "Engorgement charm?" Scott cried, and with a flick the bird grew larger. Lambo landed, and without another word, complied with Scott's next command. "Quick, Hogwarts!" Scott scrambled onto Lambo's back. The bird sprang into the air, racing through the trees toward Hogwarts. The wind stung his face and forced his eyes shut. He buried his head in Lambo's neck and clung on. After a breathless blur, the gusts eased, and Scott opened his eyes. They were already beyond the forest, above the edge of the Forbidden Forest, within the grounds of Hogwarts. "Woof, woof, woof!" Hagrid's barks announced himself. Hagrid, holding Fang, was striding toward them. "Who are you? This is Hogwarts," Hagrid demanded as Lambo touched down. "It's me, Scott Trollope, Professor Hagrid." Scott patted Lambo and slid off. "It's you? Oh, Scott?" Hagrid's eyes went wide. "It's summer. What are you doing here?" "No time to explain." Scott hopped down. "Is Professor Dumbledore at the castle?" Hagrid scratched his head. "Dumbledore? Dunno. Need him for something?" "We were attacked by Death Eaters abroad. I escaped by portkey, but Professor Flitwick and two classmates are still there." "Professor Flitwick?" Hagrid's face went pale. "Let's go. We'll find Dumbledore." He scooped Scott up in a giant hand as if he were a chick and ran toward the castle. "Fang, don't follow," Hagrid barked, and Fang obediently stayed. Scott tried to say he could walk, but Hagrid's speed swallowed his words. The half-giant ran as fast as any human could only dream of. Heavy footfalls pounded up the path. Inside the castle, they were met with Madame Norris's furious shriek. "Hagrid, you!" Filch's roar began and vanished as Hagrid thundered past. Thump, thump, thump. Hagrid bounded up to the third-floor landing and stopped at the stone gargoyle guarding the headmaster's office. He set Scott down, mildly annoyed. "Oh, sorry. I don't know the password." Before Scott could grimace, the disturbance they'd caused was already known to Dumbledore. The entrance opened by itself. They passed through the moving stone wall. Scott didn't wait for the moving staircases, but sprinted up the stairs and reached the 8th floor in record time. The headmaster's office door stood open. "Professor Dumbledore." Scott burst into the office, breathless. "The Caros ambushed me. I portkeyed out, but Professor Flitwick, Roger, and Milton are still there." Dumbledore, sitting behind his desk, took the news gravely. "Was Phileas injured when you left?" "No, those two were after me. They hid in the crowd and cast death curses at me at the same time." Hagrid, who had followed inside, let out a startled exclamation. Death! Death! Thank Merlin, you managed to escape that attack, Hagrid said, relief and amazement mingled in his voice. I ran away, Scott said, guilt pricking him. He could feel that knot of unease in his chest. I'm worried about Professor Flitwick and the others. No one will blame you, Hagrid said kindly. Scott had been careless, he thought. He had noticed something was off, but hadn't been fully on guard, assuming nobody would act so blatantly in daylight. By the time it happened, it was too late to respond. That's true, Dumbledore agreed. You said Phileas was all right. Trust his strength. Still, Scott pushed the concern that there might be more enemies nearby. Dumbledore stood. We must go. It seems I will be needed abroad. He strode to the fireplace and grasped a handful of flue powder. I'll take Scott. Hagrid, tell Minerva what's happened. All right, Professor Dumbledore. Hagrid nodded. Ministry of Magic, Dumbledore intoned, and green flames flared up around the hearth. Scott followed Dumbledore into the fire. After traveling through fireplaces, they emerged into the Ministry of Magic's atrium. Night had fallen. The vast space felt empty. Dumbledore waited just outside the fireplace with one of the young duty wizards. We must go to Austria, Dumbledore told the young wizard. The man hesitated. Professor Dumbledore, I can't authorize that. Is someone on duty at the Department of International Magical Cooperation? Dumbledore asked. No, please come back tomorrow, the young wizard said. That will not do, Dumbledore said. Someone must be on duty at the Auror office. Notify them for me. Right away, the young wizard replied. He dashed to the desk, scrawled a note, then flicked his wand. The paper folded into a paper airplane and wobbled away. The elevator opened with a soft chime, and the sound of a heavy cane tapped across the floor. Oh, Mad-Eye, the young wizard muttered, and Scott understood. Alastor Moody limped toward them, leaning on his cane. Albus, why are you here? What's happened? Moody barked loudly. He was a hard, scarred man, gray hair, a battered face, even part of his nose missing, and one eye was a weird blue orb that wrinkled and rotated independently of the other. Death Eaters attacked Phileas and some students abroad. We need to go to Austria, Alastor. Dumbledore explained. Bloody horrible, Moody spat. He fixed his magical eye on Scott. You're taking this student with you? He demanded. Scott is the one who escaped the scene, Dumbledore said, patting Scott's shoulder. Scott, this is Alastor Moody. He's the Ministry's best Auror. Moody's eyes swept over Scott. Tell me the truth, kid. What happened? Scott quickly repeated his story. Moody's magical eye spun and clicked. He hobbled to a nearby fireplace and peered in, then snatched up a handful of flue powder. Let's go. With this kind of attack, we need to speak with the local wizards. Mr. Moody, the duty wizard protested. The International Flue Network requires an authorization to use. Move, Moody snapped, and tapped the young man with his cane. I'm an Auror. I don't need the usual paperwork for an emergency. The duty wizard stumbled backward. Moody had already stepped through the fireplace. This is an emergency you won't understand, kid. Your rules will only delay us. Young folks these days have no vigilance, he muttered as he left. Mr. Moody, Professor Dumbledore, the duty wizard called after them, flustered. Moody waved them off impatiently. This matter is my responsibility, he said, and then, boom, Austrian Ministry of Magic. Green flames spat, and Scott, Dumbledore, and Moody emerged into an equally quiet Austrian ministry hall. A young witch on duty blinked at them. I am an Auror from the British Ministry of Magic, Moody announced brusquely. If your work is functioning, you should already know about the attack in Vienna involving British wizards. Moody explained who they were and why they had come. Please show us where the people involved are staying, he said. At that, Scott let out a silent, grateful breath. Someone, Strauss, an official, turned from a nearby stairwell and led the way, complaining loudly as he walked. This has caused a terrible amount of trouble. Over 100 Muggles saw a dangerous duel, and our people are still working overtime to undo memories. Dumbledore offered a quick, formal apology, gentle and slightly amused in tone, which softened the man's expression. They followed Strauss up a stone staircase, down a wide corridor lined with high glass windows, and into the Auror office. There, seated in the office, safe and unharmed, were Professor Flitwick and Scott's classmates Roger and Milton. Professor Flitwick, Roger, Milton! Scott's chest unclenched. Relief rushed through him. Scott! They rose at once, their faces lighting up. Thank Merlin, you're all right. Professor Flitwick looked substantially relieved to see him safe. Facing the concerned looks of Professor Flitwick and his two roommates, Scott apologized. I'm sorry. I ran away. I've been worried ever since. No, Professor Flitwick interrupted, looking at him with unusual gravity. You made the right choice. The only choice. Scott had thought the same, but the guilt gnawed at him regardless. Hearing Flitwick say it aloud eased him more than he expected. Flitwick patted his arm and turned to Dumbledore and Moody. Oh, Albus, Alastor, thank you for coming. Moody snapped. You're welcome, Phileas. Where are the culprits who attacked you? They got away. Flitwick sounded helpless. I couldn't hold them. Roger, who had been standing nearby, spoke up. The scene was chaotic, and there were a lot of muggles. Professor Flitwick had to protect everyone, so they slipped away. Dumbledore chuckled. All right, let the adults handle it from here. You three should rest. Flitwick whispered to Strauss, and a young Auror soon appeared. He led Scott and the others into a small lounge. You boys stay here quietly until your professor comes to collect you, he instructed, then left and closed the door. Scott sagged in relief. Merlin, I was scared stiff, Roger blurted, slapping Scott on the shoulder. You disappeared so suddenly, Roger went on, eyes wide. One moment you were there, the next you were submerged in a green light. I thought you were dead. I'm sorry, Scott said again. I couldn't think of anything else. I had to activate the port key. You did the right thing, Roger said, laughing. Too bad you missed the look on those two fellows' faces and an absolutely furious Professor Flitwick. He exaggerated the memory with theatrical gestures. An angry Phileas Flitwick is terrifying. Those two were punished so badly they barely escaped. Roger, possessed by excitement, kept talking and describing the chaos. Scott listened, and bit by bit, understood more of what had happened. The Muggles thought we were putting on some kind of magic show at first, Roger explained. They pressed forward. Even reporters were taking pictures. It wasn't until those two reverted to their original forms after Flitwick attacked them that the crowd realized something was very wrong. If it hadn't been for the Muggles panicking, Flitwick, going all out, would have taken those two damned Death Eaters down. Scott felt a surge of relief. I'm glad, he said. I've been worried they'd try another ambush. They were after me. If any of you had been hurt because of me. He stopped, the rest unspoken. This was the second time. He sounded calm, but inside he was anything but. Twice his friends had been endangered because of him. He was furious. Part of him wanted to strike back, consequences be damned. He had suppressed the impulse, but he hadn't abandoned it. He would make the Caro siblings pay. Milton. Roger turned to Milton, who had been silent. Don't beat yourself up. This wasn't your fault. No, Milton said, voice breaking. You came to Austria because of me. Scott walked over and put a hand on Milton's shoulder. How could you think that? They were after me. He squeezed the other boy's shoulder. I'm sorry your concert couldn't end properly because of this, but your performance was brilliant. The audience loved you. It's my fault, Milton muttered, head down. My name was in a British paper. Maybe that's how they found out about the concert and found you. You're splitting hairs, Scott said, helpless. Those kinds of people will find an opportunity no matter what. Milton only lowered his head further. Roger shrugged sympathetically. Scott tried to reassure him again. This was an accident. They were after me. No one's going to blame you. Milton's legs gave out and he slumped onto the sofa. I know what you mean, Scott. I was at the door being interviewed when I saw you submerged in that green light, like the killing curse. He choked on the words, shaken. Scott didn't know whether to tell him everything. He thought of Mr. Greaves and the woman who might be Milton's mother, who had appeared in the concert hall. He'd meant to leave that to Professor Flitwick, an elder to handle the explanation, and Flitwick probably hadn't had a chance to speak to Milton yet. Milton looked up. He had the uncanny sensitivity of someone like Luna Lovegood. Is there something you're not telling me, Scott? He asked. Scott forced a smile. Yes. He didn't intend to lie. How did you know? It's obvious, Milton said. You looked hesitant. Scott gave a rueful thumbs up. Milton fixed him with a steady gaze. Tell me, what happened? Just then Roger interrupted. Who was the third wizard at the performance besides the Caro siblings? Was it my father? Milton blurted. Yes. Scott no longer tried to hide it. Milton's expression tightened. So he really came. You noticed? Scott asked. I felt a familiar gaze, but I didn't see a familiar face, Milton said. Before Scott could ask more, the lounge door opened and Professor Flitwick came in. Are you all right? He asked. We're fine, Roger said. Can we go now, Professor? Of course. You are underage. Leave early. Flitwick smiled. I'll take you to the Great Hall. You can return to Britain through the International Flow Network and wait for us at Hogwarts. Roger hesitated. And Milton, what about his situation? Go to Hogwarts first, Flitwick said. Milton can come when his matter is handled. I will make sure he is brought over. Thank you, Professor. Milton stood quickly. Flitwick nodded and led them downstairs, watching the three leave through the fireplace. They popped out in the atrium of the British Ministry of Magic and startled the young wizard on duty, who had dozed at his desk. Scott explained quickly, and the three took another fireplace to the headmaster's office at Hogwarts. It was past midnight, but Professor McGonagall and Hagrid were awake, waiting. Mr. Trollope, Mr. Davis, Mr. Greaves. Professor McGonagall's voice was tight with concern. Once the three had explained, both she and Hagrid breathed with relief. It's good to see you all safe, she said, and once she understood the situation, waved them away to rest. I've had the house elves tidy your dormitories. They thanked her and left, moving through the empty castle. Scott took the others to the prefect's bathroom for a soak, then went back to the dormitory and slept hard. It's summer vacation, and I wake up in this bed feeling like my holiday's been evaporated, Roger grumbled when Scott woke the next morning. Scott smiled, shrugged, put on slippers, picked up his wand, and aimed it at his chest. Amato, animo, animato, animagus, he murmured, feeling his second heartbeat steady and familiar, the ritual that confirmed he was himself. After washing, Scott noticed Milton watching him a lot, as if he wanted to speak but couldn't. The three of them went down to the kitchens for a big breakfast. After, Professor Flitwick's Patronus summoned them to his office. The incident's been contained, Flitwick said. The Austrian ministry has taken measures to limit the impact on Muggles. Dumbledore and Moody will likely remain to handle some negotiations for a while. Scott felt a twinge of regret. He wanted to speak to Dumbledore about Mr. Bode's arrest. The timing had been suspicious. Elijah Caro's reaction during his trial matched details in a letter Mr. Bode had sent, and Scott suspected a connection. He suspected memory modifications of the accused and witnesses might be tied to Mr. Bode. He wanted to find the Caro siblings and believed Mr. Bode might lead him to them. He didn't want to miss any clue. Flitwick let Scott and Roger go first, asking that Milton remain for longer. Scott understood and left, confident Flitwick would handle the rest. By noon, they were back in the dormitory. Milton sat on the windowsill, knees hugged to his chest, face blank and dazed. He didn't seem to register Scott and Roger's conversation. They exchanged a glance. Neither of them spoke. Some things people had to come to terms with alone. Scott found himself wanting to rail at that couple who may or may not have been divorced. If the divorce was staged, why would Mr. Greaves pretend to be separated, then marry another woman while hiding his ex? It sounded absurd. Roger broke the silence. I wonder how long we'll be staying at Hogwarts. I still want to watch the Quidditch World Cup matches. Milton remained motionless. After a long moment, Scott moved closer to the window. We don't even know for sure it was your mother, Milton, he said softly. If it was, it might not be bad. At least you'd know she's all right. Milton's dull eyes shifted. I'd rather she be hidden away and safe than somewhere I don't know about, he said. Then I wouldn't have to keep searching. I could focus on my music. His voice wavered, and tears began to fall. Scott stepped forward to comfort him. I don't think she meant to deceive you, he said. Maybe she had no choice. Maybe Mr. Greaves only found her recently. Thank you, Scott, Milton said through his tears. You don't have to comfort me like this. I'm just very happy. Really, I am. Scott fell silent. He could tell, just as easily as he could read a room, whether Milton's emotions were genuine or not. He knew, in that moment, that Milton's joy was a fragile mask. Still, Scott held his tongue. He would not expose Milton's lie now. Milton's low spirits inevitably rubbed off on Scott and Roger. None of them wanted to leave until Dumbledore returned to Hogwarts. Milton was still intent on going to Austria to pursue his musical dreams. He hadn't formally decided to drop out of Hogwarts, but it was obvious he was leaning that way. When the subject came up, he told Scott and Roger, "I've already spoken to Professor Flitwick. He says I should hang on for at least 2 more years." As Milton's teacher, Flitwick did not approve of him quitting. 2 more years, the professor argued, would at least raise Milton's magical ability enough to make him a more competent wizard and safer in the long run. Milton, however, looked exhausted by the wizarding world and wanted only to retreat into music. It was, Scott thought, an attempt to escape. Scott didn't press him. He sympathized, but couldn't truly relate. Anything he said would feel pointless. Scott had enough tangled problems of his own and needed time to think. He went to the room of requirement, Helena's study. Scott, Helena in the portrait sounded surprised. "It's summer vacation. Why are you here?" "Something happened." Scott told her about the attack in Austria. "That's rotten luck," Helena said sympathetically. "You went to a concert and I'm used to it." Scott shrugged. Accidents had followed him for 2 years. Helena opened the inner door, and he stepped in to speak with the Ravenclaw mentor in the portrait. "I heard your conversation with Helena," the Ravenclaw said gently. "If you want to avoid further fallout, you need to resolve some of these troubles quickly." "I'll find the Caro siblings and make them disappear," Scott said. "That won't be easy." The Ravenclaw smiled faintly. "Even assuming you can find them, you must prevent other Death Eaters from discovering you acted." "Not just Death Eaters," Scott said. "Indeed." The Ravenclaw's expression was grave. "As far as I know, your potions professor is acting as Dumbledore's double agent within the Death Eater organization." Scott's eyebrows shot up. "You just tell me that casually?" "You are my apprentice," the Ravenclaw replied with the same calm smile. Scott managed to smile in return. No matter how complicated things grew, the Ravenclaw mentor was on his side. Then she asked, "Do you still have that mariner's astrolabe?" "Oh, yes." Scott fetched the small instrument from his shape-changing lizard skin satchel. "Place it in the very center of the room," the Ravenclaw instructed. "Move those tables and chairs out and wait outside." Scott set the astrolabe on the floor and waved his wand. The desk and chairs rose and floated into the outer room. Light filled the little inner chamber, dazzling blue and white, then faded. "Come in." When the light dimmed, the Ravenclaw spoke. "This object is harmless. Communicate more. Perhaps you will gain unexpected insights." Scott felt a wash of relief and bowed his thanks. The Ravenclaw added, "Since you are here, continue your lessons." Scott had no objection. The lesson lasted only half a day. After lunch, he went alone into the forest to the Raven territory to meet Lambeau. "Still no news," Lambeau reported at Oak Cottage. The Ravens had been searching for traces of Voldemort, Barty Crouch Jr., and other Death Eaters for a long time with nothing to show for it. The hunt for the Caro siblings had been similarly fruitless. "Have you found Malfoy Manor?" Scott asked. In the original story, after Voldemort's return, Malfoy Manor became his headquarters. Scott wondered if that had changed. "All British wizards know the Malfoys love parties and host lavish balls at the manor," Lambeau said. "But lately they've been very low-key." "That's suspicious," Scott said. "Voldemort could be hiding at Malfoy Manor." "The location of a pureblood family manor is normally kept secret," Lambeau replied. "I think a few people do know the address," Scott said, a thought striking him. "Mr. Weasley, for one. The Ministry searched Malfoy Manor once. Fred and George might know." He considered asking them, then stopped. "They could get information out, but it might put them at risk," he said. After a moment, he had another idea. He took out his Scholar Alliance ID, opened the Book of Prometheus, and searched the knowledge bank. Nothing. Not discouraged, Scott posted the question anonymously and offered a reward of 500 academic credits. The credits were claimed in under a minute. Malfoy Manor is located 6 kilometers north of Wootton Bassett, Wiltshire. The answerer was anonymous. Scott smiled. Lambeau asked, "Shall I go and check?" "No," Scott said. "You'd likely be discovered. Don't forget, Voldemort might be there, and you were spotted by Medea once." Lambeau's head drooped. "We don't know what kind of change a wizard's magic undergoes when it reaches the level of Voldemort or Dumbledore. Better to be cautious." Scott agreed. "You keep the Ravens watching from the periphery. I'll handle the surveillance directly." Ordinary ravens wouldn't trigger an awakening. Scott also wanted to test the set of runic circuits Ravenclaw had given him for his birthday. He sent Lambo to carry him back to Hogwarts and set to work learning the runic circuits as fast as he could, trying to get their effects into practice. In the Ravenclaw common room, Scott bent over his desk, muttering as he worked. Milton sat by the window, practicing the cello without pause. Roger paced, flopped on the sofa, and then played a game of wizard's chess alone. After some time, Roger suddenly burst out, "I can't take it anymore." Scott and Milton looked up, startled. "I'm bored," Roger said, sprawling like an overgrown child. "You can leave Hogwarts now and enjoy your summer vacation." "You could just leave," Scott said. "Yeah," Milton agreed. Unlike Scott and Milton, who stayed because they had things to do, Roger could have taken the holiday and gone to the Quidditch World Cup. "Hey, I'm staying to keep you two company," he protested. "Is this how you treat a loyal, caring friend?" "Thanks, Roger," Milton smiled, "but you don't have to stay. If you drop out, we won't see you for ages," Roger mumbled. Scott laughed, and Roger flushed. "What are you blushing for?" Scott teased. Roger covered his face. "I think I was a little mushy." "You don't blush for flirting," Scott taunted. "You blush when you're sentimental." Before they could tease Roger properly, a flock of owls burst through the window and dropped a pile of letters and small packages in front of Scott. Oh, Scott had only lifted the shielding charm on his name that morning. He fed some treats to the owls and began opening the mail. "Are these your belated birthday presents?" Roger asked as he peered over Scott's shoulder. "Probably," Scott said. Most envelopes contained cards. Fred and George had sent a ticket to the Quidditch World Cup final, an invitation to go with them on August 22nd. "A final ticket?" Roger grabbed it. "There's still a month to go, and tickets are already out. I need to get one now. Who knows which teams will make it, but the British team has a shot this year." Scott tuned out Roger's Quidditch commentary and opened the other gifts. Luna's present was a homemade necklace. A silver chain, threaded with small white bones of unknown creatures, brown hawk feathers and black raven feathers, less eccentric than her carrot earrings, but still Luna. Harry had sent a special half-year issue of today's Transfiguration. Savannah had sent another golden acorn. She claimed this one healed injuries and was reusable. The previous one had sealed offensive spells. Most others had sent cards. Scott felt lighter, less obligated. He could simply reply with cards for others' birthdays. After putting everything away, he wrote thank you notes, some long, some short, and went to the owlery to send them. That afternoon, Dumbledore returned to Hogwarts. In the evening, the few professors who remained on holiday and the 3 students shared dinner in the Great Hall. After they ate, thunder rolled outside, and rain began to lash the castle. "Oh, I can transform!" Scott stood up, excited. "That's right," Professor McGonagall said at once. "Go fetch your potion and try it under my supervision." "I'm going," Scott said, and activated the portkey. "Lambo." He arrived at the Raven territory in a downpour. He cast a waterproof charm on himself, and Lambo flew him to the cliff where he'd buried the potion. He used a charm to move the large stone and dug the bottle from the ground. Lambo carried him back to Hogwarts at top speed. The rain beat down the whole time, and even with the waterproof charm, Scott was soaked through. When he stumbled back into the Great Hall, everyone was still there. "You buried the potion in the Forbidden Forest?" Professor McGonagall asked, frowning. She waved her wand and dried him and his clothes in an instant. She didn't press him about the Raven ride. Instead, she said, "Steady your breathing and your mind. You remember the rest. I've taught you the steps before." Scott breathed deeply, pointed his wand at his heart, and intoned the spell. Then he uncorked the bottle and tipped his head back, drinking the entire red potion. Scott pointed the tip of his wand at his chest and whispered the incantation. "Amato, animo, animato, animagus." He tilted his head back and downed the small bottle of red potion in one gulp. Almost immediately, he felt a second heartbeat starting up inside him, pounding harder and harder like a restless drum. "Clear out. Give him some space," Professor McGonagall's voice ordered, but Scott had no energy to respond. A deep, all-consuming pain spread through him. Sweat broke out across his skin. Every ounce of his concentration had to be spent on staying sane. He knew that keeping his human mind intact was the most important part of the transformation. He had to remain conscious, keep himself present, and resist being overwhelmed by the animal's wildness. The second heartbeat became clearer, and a foreign consciousness surged toward his thoughts, as if something else were trying to take the wheel. Panic threatened. This was the feeling of being possessed. But the last thread of his reason pushed him to accept it, not fight it. Instinct screamed otherwise, but Scott forced himself to think logically. He felt his body change. His height seemed to decrease. His vision dipped lower. Something pushed through his skin, feathers. His body grew lighter. His hands slipped away, his wand clattering to the floor. His arms reshaped themselves into wings, the shoes on his feet dissolving into sharp talons. The way his feet touched the ground altered fundamentally. Magic in his body felt like it was draining away. Keeping that fragile grip on human thought was agony. Another mind already occupied more than half of his brain, simple and instinctive rather than thoughtful. Scott's rational consciousness had to influence and contain that animal awareness, to tame it, to pull it into cooperation. It was a tug of war, and it took everything he had. Slowly, after an interval he couldn't measure, his human will broke through the restraint and unfurled. The two strands of awareness merged, with Scott's original mind dominant. His senses sharpened again. From a new angle, he saw McGonagall and the others, heard their voices. "Mr. Trollope?" McGonagall looked down at him, suddenly enormous. "Are you all right?" Scott gave a quick nod. McGonagall's smile was relief itself. "Very good. It seems you have succeeded. Scott, you did it." "That's wonderful. You look splendid," came Milton and Roger's excited voices. "Now try to move," McGonagall instructed. "Follow the instincts of this body and get used to how it moves." Scott obeyed. Trusting his body, he beat the limbs that were wings and awkwardly launched himself, wobbling at first until a thrill of flight took over. Self-powered flight was intoxicating. The exhilaration rose through him. He climbed toward the great hall ceiling, circling, feeling the air under powerful wings. He flashed past the window and caught his reflection, a peregrine falcon exactly as he had imagined, compact, muscular, with broad, swept wings. Outside, lightning stabbed the sky and rain hammered the panes, but the falcon's urge was to leave and ride the storm. Scott stifled it and slowed. "Very good. Now try to transform back into human form. Don't panic. Picture your human body as clearly as you can," McGonagall's voice came again. Scott landed and concentrated on the image of himself. Where the magic had felt so faint a moment before, it surged back. The change back into human form was quicker than the change into animal, and soon he was himself again. He lowered his head and looked at his hands with a grin. "I did it. A successful animagus transformation." McGonagall was the first to clap. The other professors and his roommates followed. "Thank you for your guidance, Professor," Scott said, bowing. McGonagall beamed. "You are the most talented student I have ever taught. Keep practicing, and you'll master it quickly." Roger and Milton came over, and Roger picked Scott's wand up and handed it back. The three of them huddled together as the other professors left the Great Hall. Scott wanted to speak to Dumbledore about the other matters on his mind. "Professor Dumbledore," he began. Dumbledore turned, smiling kindly. "Oh, Scott, I think what you need most is rest. The first attempt takes a great deal out of you. Let us speak tomorrow." Scott felt the fatigue settle into his bones. Excitement ebbed, and his limbs were weak. He could only nod. Roger and Milton supported him as they left the hall. At the entrance, Lambo, the bird that had been waiting, peered at him curiously. Scott waved his wand and restored Lambo to its original size. The bird met his gaze for a handful of seconds, cawed, spread its wings, and vanished into the rain. On the walk back to Ravenclaw Tower, the two roommates chattered, still buzzing from the spectacle. "Once you're good at it, you can fly anywhere. No more long walks," Roger said. "You could even watch Quidditch World Cup matches without buying a ticket." Scott gave him a look. Milton added, "You'll have to register the animagus form with the ministry." "Oh," Roger frowned. "That's such a bore. Can't he keep it secret?" "No," Milton said. "It's illegal to hide an animagus form. So many people saw it today. He can't avoid registering." Roger looked at Scott. "You should have tried it in private." "I had no choice," Scott said. "Professor McGonagall and Professor Flitwick helped me through it." At the base of the tower, the three of them looked up at the narrow spiral staircase. Scott regarded it like an enemy. "Let me float you up," Roger offered with a grin, and cast a simple charm. Since the castle was empty of other students, Scott didn't feel embarrassed. He lay back and let the charm lift him, drifting up the stairs into the common room. Roger set him down on a long sofa. Scott drank another restorative potion and slowly felt strength returning. After a night's sleep, he was finally back to normal. After breakfast, they went to see Professor Flitwick. Dumbledore was there as well. Flitwick began with Milton's situation. "Have you decided?" he asked firmly. "I do not approve of you abandoning your studies just now. Think with reason, not emotion." Dumbledore spoke to Milton too. "I've heard what happened to you, my boy, but give yourself time. Don't leap to a decision." Milton looked bewildered. "I'm sorry. I don't know." "Perhaps speak with Mr. Greaves," Flitwick suggested. "He works at the ministry. I can arrange a discreet meeting." Milton hesitated. "I'm not sure how to talk to him yet. Thank you for your help." "Don't be anxious." Flitwick's face was gentle. "The trouble in Austria has calmed. Spend the summer on your music. Take time to think things through. We'll meet before term, and you can give me your answer then." Milton agreed, eyes already red. "I'll follow your arrangement. Thank you for everything." "It's only right. You are my student," Flitwick said with a smile. Scott and Roger reached out to pat Milton's shoulder. Dumbledore turned to Scott. "Now, Scott," he said. He asked Roger and Milton to step outside. The two glanced at Scott with concern, then left and closed the door. "You wish to speak about Broderick?" Dumbledore asked. Scott nodded. "Bill told me Mr. Bode is imprisoned and that Mr. Weasley discovered something, but he didn't say much." Dumbledore nodded. "Very few people knew, and I did not know, how deep Broderick's work went. He was an expert in manipulating memory. As an unspeakable in the Department of Mysteries, his research was not public." Scott remembered the trial now. At the trial, the defendant and his witnesses offered to undergo veritaserum, which suggested their memories had been tampered with. Was that Broderick working with the Death Eaters or the Caro family? "You could say that," Dumbledore admitted. "Broderick would not confess. Arthur Weasley uncovered his crimes. He was secretly manipulating the memories of other unspeakables." Scott was surprised. "Mr. Weasley found out. He deserves thanks." Dumbledore smiled. "Arthur is a principled and formidable wizard. His talents are not always obvious in the ways others display power." Scott thought of the twins' inventions and the flying car fiasco. Fred and George's creations and that flying Ford Anglia speak to that in their own way. Dumbledore agreed, but Scott's next question remained. "Can we find the Death Eaters or Voldemort from Broderick's work?" "I'm afraid not," Dumbledore said, "and we are not the only ones searching. Miss Slytherin has also been looking for Voldemort's whereabouts." Scott felt a twinge of disappointment, but was not surprised. His ravens were already watching Malfoy Manor. He decided to wait until he had concrete evidence before involving Dumbledore. Flitwick added a caution. "Scott, I know you're angry about the Caro siblings' attack, but please don't act on impulse." "I understand," Scott said. He would not take reckless risks. The conversation petered out. He could not pry any more information free, so he resolved to speed his own work, learn the new rune circuits, refine his methods. They did not stay at Hogwarts much longer. That afternoon, following Flitwick to London, they saw Milton off. Milton was continuing on to Vienna. Scott declined Roger's invitation to visit his home. After being attacked twice by the Caro siblings, he did not want to risk involving anyone else. After a quick call to his parents to explain the situation, he returned to Oak Cottage in Raven Territory by Portkey. Back in Raven Territory, Scott threw himself into two things: a fixed daily regimen to sharpen his animagus skills, and an all-consuming study of runic circuits. Lambeau bought his food from Hogsmeade and brought it back. After 5 days of almost no sleep and hardly any food, intense, focused practice, he finally had the runic circuit set down. He rewarded himself with a proper bath, real sleep, and then spent 3 days remodeling the magic mirror from his notes into what he called Magic Mirror 2.0, adding the ability to receive remote signals. "Now let's test it," he said. Sitting cross-legged on the porch of Oak Cottage, Scott set a small transfigured lizard on the floor, picked up the modified mirror, and touched its surface. The mirror filled with the lizard's point of view in real time. Connection successful. "To Lambeau," he said, Take that lizard and fly as far away as you can. The farther the better. Why not just let it turn into a bird? Lambeau complained. Lizards are less conspicuous, Scott said. I want to use it to infiltrate Malfoy Manor. All right. Lambeau snatched the lizard with its claws and launched into the air. Scott leaned back against the cottage's wooden wall, legs outstretched, and watched the changing image in the mirror. Lambeau flew fast. The mirror showed forest canopies streaming by. It flew farther than Scott had intended, out of the Highlands and all the way toward southern England. Scott realized belatedly that Lambeau was heading straight for Malfoy Manor in Wiltshire. He had planned to test first, and only then approach the manor, but by the time he thought it through, he let Lambeau continue. Bored with watching every second, Scott switched to the Book of Prometheus to message Bill and Lucio, Ray, only returning his attention to the mirror that evening when Lambeau neared the destination. The image stayed clear even at the great distance, and Scott felt both satisfied and a bit smug. Lambeau flew over a small town, crossed fields, and joined a roost of crows in a copse near the manor. Crows Lambeau had arranged to help with surveillance. Obeying Scott's instructions, Lambeau didn't approach the manor itself, but handed the lizard off to one of those crows. The crow took the lizard and continued on. After a short distance, the crow began to veer off its path, turning involuntarily. Scott frowned. Some kind of charm. Malfoy Manor's defenses were stricter than he'd expected, tighter even than Yaxley Castle's, strong enough to affect ordinary birds. Lambeau, outside the mirror's frame, must have noticed as well. It sent another crow. The two crows cawed, exchanged a few words, and together placed the lizard on the ground. The transfigured lizard, programmed with a basic survival instinct, crawled forward on its own. Scott watched anxiously, trying to see if it could pass the boundary. It crawled only so far before it, too, began to veer off. The crow, likely on Lambeau's command, picked the lizard up and carried it back to the roosting wood. After a few more caws, Lambeau took the lizard again and climbed higher into the sky. Scott thought the same thing Lambeau must have. At some altitude, you might be above the defensive charm's reach. When the bird rose and flew over what Scott knew to be the manor's grounds, the disguised patch of woods that had been masking the estate dropped away in the mirror, and he saw the aerial view he'd hoped for. Malfoy Manor stood dignified and grand, a lordly mansion ringed by geometrically trimmed gardens, fountains, and perfectly clipped hedges. The lizard dropped and landed on the lawn among several white peacocks who converged at once. The lizard darted into a hedge. Luckily, Scott's transmutation left it able to flee, and the peacocks raised a racket. A suppressed boy's voice cut through the noise. Scott smiled. The voice was familiar. Draco Malfoy appeared, thinner than Scott remembered. Just 20-odd days had passed, but Draco looked gaunt, cheeks hollowed, eyes rimmed and fearful, his complexion nearly paper white. Quiet, Draco hissed as he crouched by the hedge. If you make a sound, you'll die painfully, and even Father and I won't be able to save you. Draco. Professor Snape. The professor's voice answered from the edge of the lawn. Draco stood and went to meet him. Your break is over, Snape said coldly. Yes, Professor. Draco followed him in, and Scott watched as Snape's black robes glided toward the house. As they reached the doorway, Draco tried to speak eagerly. Professor, will I be able to join you and Master soon? Snape snapped his head back, his tone a hard warning. Don't speak that way, Draco. You're not ready to do anything for the Master yet. Do what you are told. Do not act on your own initiative. Yes, Professor. The boy's eagerness evaporated. Scott felt a bitter twist at seeing Snape there. His double agent was still in place, which meant Dumbledore knew where Voldemort was hiding. Why Dumbledore did not act was another matter. Scott suspected it had something to do with Harry's presence as an accidental Horcrux. That was a problem for later. Right now, he was focused on what he could learn about the manor. The lizard moved again, an inch-long shadow on the stone. It crept along the outer wall to a first-floor window and settled on the sill, so dusted and dull it almost merged with the stone. Through the window, Scott saw the room he'd been hoping for. A gathering of Death Eaters, Caro's siblings among them, talking quietly. Draco's parents were present, and the windows were open for summer air, yet no sound drifted outside. The rooms were soundproofed by magic. Scott tried to lip-read but lacked the skill. He could make out faces but didn't recognize any of them. He hadn't seen Barty Crouch Jr. before, despite hearing his name, so even that possibility was uncertain. After a short while, the meeting broke up and people left the room. The lizard watched as most of them filed out the manor's front door. A middle-aged wizard issued a stern command. Go back, hide well, and await the master's summons. He turned and addressed the Carrows. Until the master gives orders, I don't want any more independent action. You've drawn Dumbledore's attention twice with your foolishness and even alarmed wizards abroad. Calm down, Parkinson. Amicus Carrow said low. We only wanted to kill that mudblood to avenge our poor nephew. Parkinson's voice was like gravel. Don't care why your nephew died. That boy murdered his fiancée and made the Roar family our enemy. The master is displeased with you. Sorry. Amicus's voice had dropped. We won't act on our own again. You'd better not. Parkinson strode through the garden and through the gates, apparating away. The others followed. One by one they vanished. Only the Carrows remained. What do we do now? Amicus asked, glancing back toward the house. Alecto Carrow, younger but fierce and decisive, said we can't move for now. He's protected by Dumbledore and Flitwick. Damn it, Amicus ground his teeth. We'll wait. When the master gives the word, we can hit Hogwarts openly. They argued a bit more and then apparated away as well, leaving Scott staring helplessly. He had briefly hoped the lizard might cling to one of them and be carried off, an accidental ride to their hiding place. But his creation lacked that intelligence, and he had no way to control it remotely. Still, the test proved a point. The lizard had infiltrated the manor grounds. It suggested the obvious next step for his surveillance devices, remote control. That would require more modifications, and he only had the faintest idea how to begin. For now, the little lizard began to climb again. The first-floor rooms were empty. The reptile worked its way upward. On the second floor, Scott glimpsed the Malfoy couple arguing in a room. Again, he could see lips move but hear no sound. In another chamber, he watched Draco being coached by Snape as he brewed a potion. The lizard skittered around the exterior wall until it had surveyed the whole building. No sign of Voldemort in any of the rooms. One idea remained. Voldemort was probably in the basement. Scott hadn't expected that. Voldemort always put himself above others. Scott had imagined him occupying the grandest quarters. Not seeing him in the main rooms left Scott unsure, disappointed, relieved, both. He worried whether his little spy would be detected the moment it crossed the threshold. Fortunately, nothing catastrophic happened. For now, the thing Scott feared most, an immediate, unmistakable encounter with the Dark Lord, had not occurred.